All right. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, I've got Dr. Carrier here, and we're going to be going through some Bayesian calculations with y'all tonight. I do have some topics to bring up. I've got a little list here that I've been working on today, trying to figure out some good questions to run calculations against. And so I do have that up, and we will be going through those if necessary. We do already have a caller in the queue. If you guys don't know, this is a call-in show tonight. So the number to call is in the title. It's also in the description. So you can do those two things. I've actually got to update the description with the actual call-in link, because there's actually a link that you can hit if you can't call like from your phone or anything. There is a way to call over the web, so I'm going to get that put in the description. But I figured, Rick, if you wanted to, could you start us off? In case anybody doesn't know who you are, can you introduce yourself and tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, my name's Richard Carrier. If you want to know anything about me, all things me are at richardcarrier.info. So that's on the web at richardcarrier.info. And I have a PhD in ancient history, ancient intellectual history, but I'm published also in philosophy, including philosophy of history and philosophy of mathematics. So that touches on this subject as well. I'm known for introducing in a practical way, the use of Bayesian methodology in vetting historical reasoning, basically, and presenting and vetting historical reasoning. I'm not the first one to come up with the idea. Avizer Tucker, a philosopher of history, produced something before me on this, so we might get into that later if it comes up. But since then, I've noticed, and I have footnotes in my new forthcoming book. Since then, I've noticed I've influenced quite a few people. So there's actually a lot of historians now, certainly, over a dozen who have started using Bayesian methodologies in their history work and recommend doing that. So anyway, so that's why we're here about that. And I helped a company develop an app called Crestus that has some content related to the historicity of Jesus that you could go through and sort of question tree a bunch of things. But one of the things that's in it that's kind of universally usable is this Bayesian calculator that we're going to go in. And, there's stuff about Bayes' theorem and things and those links that you see on the screen right now. But the bottom one gets you into the calculator. Just hit start and you're in the calculator. And then what this does is it'll walk you through an odds form of Bayes' theorem, which is the most intuitive and easiest one for ordinary people to use. And you can use this, it says probability of Jesus existing, but you can use it for anything. Probability that a UFO, flew over your house last night or whatever. The probability that the 2020 election was stolen, all that stuff. Like you could actually do anything that you want to do, any question you have, and you can kind of reason through it. And you can dink around with numbers and see what the results are and so on. And so it does all the math for you behind the scenes, including like converting odds to probabilities, which is sometimes vexes people that don't know how to do that right away. Anyway, I use this in two peer-reviewed work, actually more than that, but more formally, I did it in Proving History, which is a peer-reviewed work on historical methodology. And then I did a study on the historicity of Jesus using this methodology. Raphael Lataster did a follow-up study, basically vetting my study. And several other people have used this methodology as well. So that's how I know all of this stuff and can talk about it. And that's it for the intro. But I do lots of other things, history, philosophy, current events, and things like that. And you can check it out on my blog. You can find my social media there, the courses I teach online, my books, my blog, all of that stuff. So.
Yeah. And so right now I'm the one managing the app and doing a lot of work on it. I'm planning on expanding the Bayesian calculator to include more of what's called Likert scales. And so how normally when we describe these kinds of things, we say like least likely, most likely, or
Right.
more likely than not, or whatever. What I'm planning on doing is integrating that into the app, to where you're not having to provide like
Years
the
in.
odds
Yeah,
form.
right. That's really
Yeah.
smart. I provide a flow chart in Proving History, my book Proving History. In the back, in the appendices, one of them is a flow chart where you can do Bayesian reasoning without any numbers. You don't have to do any numbers. You just follow the flow chart. It can't handle complex questions. Sometimes you have to do the math, but when the answers are pretty straightforward, you can get results using the flow chart, and that's the kind of thing you're talking about. Except you're doing even more detail, where you can get like some sort of scales or something going.
Yeah.
I like that idea. I'd love to see it.
Yeah. I've been working on it for a while. I got sidetracked there for about a year or so, and I haven't really been working on it. But I started like getting all of the architecture and everything like that built for it, and I have a plan for it. It's just a matter of having the time to do it.
Yeah.
Which I know you're pretty busy too, so I know you understand that.
Well, especially since I just moved. I just had a
Yeah.
really complicated move, and I'm only just now getting settled. That's why my new walls, by the way, are bare. This is my new place. Because I haven't put anything up. I haven't had time. I've been too busy just getting the house in order, basically.
Yeah. So I do have a goal set for the stream. If we get 10 or more super chats of like $5 or more, we'll do a little bit of extra Q&A at the very end with Carrier here, just to sort of answer your questions and everything like that. So if we can reach that goal, then we'll definitely do that. And anyways, so Bayes' theorem, the biggest problem that I've heard from a lot of people, and then we'll get to our first caller after I ask this question. The biggest problem that I've heard people say is that the numbers are arbitrary. Like the numbers that you pick to put into Bayes' theorem is arbitrary, and you can't really accurately gauge how likely something is. What would your response be to that?
Yeah. So that's just true of all reasoning, right? Like so every time you're reasoning in any way using any kind of logic, the inputs can be arbitrary. You can just like put anything in there. In reality, they're not, right? Like when you actually think about what's likely or unlikely, you're not being arbitrary. When you're talking about like if you see a light in the sky, what you start force ranking what the probabilities are. You don't need the exact probabilities, but you know some things are more likely than others. So you're already doing the math. You do this all the time, right? So in your whole life, you're always doing this. And the way you handle uncertainty, like ambiguity, like the lack of precision, is with margins of error. So you have your lower margin and you have your higher margin, and you know it has to be somewhere in between. And the way you pick those is, well, you pick the highest one is like, that's the most I can reasonably believe it is. The probability, the frequency, that's the most I could believe it is, given all the things that I know about the world and so on. And then your lower margin is, that's the lowest I can reasonably believe it would be, given all that I know. And then what you have is a margin of error where you don't know what the probability is in between those two margins, but you know it's in between, like to some confidence level, you know it's probably most likely in between those two margins. And then from there, you can actually use that information. And in reality, all historical reasoning, for example, actually all empirical reasoning, but obviously I'm a historian and I applied this to history as well, but all historians are Bayesians. They just don't know it, right? All their arguments are Bayesian, and you can model them using Bayes' theorem. You can show they're making arguments about plausibility. Oh, that's prior probability. They're making arguments about the likelihood of the evidence. Okay, they're building likelihood ratios. They're already doing this, right? So saying that you can like, well, I'm not going to put numbers down, and therefore I'm immune from being in error about my estimates, is false. It's the other way around, right? Like if you're not willing to put numbers down, then you're actually more likely to be in error, because you're just relying on your gut feeling and a sort of fuzziness of, oh, how likely do I think that is? I don't know. I'm not even going to put a number to it. I'm not going to benchmark it. I'm not going to like work out, how do I even know the frequency of this? What is it based on? And so on. Once we are forced to actually put a number, and I pointed out in several talks that all arguments you've ever had with anyone about a matter of fact, all of them in your entire life, you've been arguing over three numbers. And you didn't know you were arguing over numbers, but you were. And you can break down, you can analyze, and you can model the argument with those three numbers. You can say, you were saying it was like a ballpark here, they were saying it was ballpark there, and that's what you were arguing about this whole time, right? It was really, you were arguing about numbers. But if you do it, if you actually put the numbers in and you see it's really just three numbers, then it becomes more clear where someone might be going wrong, right? So it's easier to vet someone's reasoning when they do this. When you actually give the Bayesian model of what you're saying, then it's easy to go in there and figure out, oh, this is where they made a mistake, or oh, this is where they're misestimating this, and here's why, and so on. Whereas if you don't do that, then you just have these historians and other people just saying, well, I just feel it in my gut. I can't really explain to you why I think my answer is more likely than yours. I can't give you any reasons or evidence too. Like I can't explain how evidence changes the probability of anything, and I can't explain how much it changes the probability of anything. But the evidence makes it more probable, right? Like, so you're just skipping all of the actual argument in there. And so you get this sort of intuitive leap, and no one can model, like, how are you even deriving your numbers? Yeah, I know you're not using numbers, but you're talking about things being more likely than others. You're talking about things being impossible. You're talking, all of these words that you use are just words about frequencies. If you're not doing the math, you're skipping the explanation of how you're even getting your estimates. And so by forcing people to use the math, then now we can start criticizing your estimates, right? We can say like, well, why is it that, right? And you say, well, okay, maybe it's this range. Okay, so now we're getting fuzzy, right? Now you're right. It's like, well, how low do you think it could be? How high do you think it could be? Now we're getting to like correcting some sort of erroneous leaps and fallacies and so forth. So that's my answer to that it's arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. It can be. Like someone can use Bayes' theorem just like William Lane Craig uses standard syllogistic logic to come up with bullshit conclusions by using bullshit inputs. Like if your premises are bullshit, your conclusion's bullshit, right? But the idea is to not talk bullshit. The idea is to use the tool not to deceive, but to do it as an honest tool of methodology where you actually care that the premises, the inputs are correct, right? And you're taking effort and you're showing people how you're deriving your premises. Like this is how I'm getting there. So you can see whether I'm correct or not. And you can find out what evidence could you present me that would change where I land on these things? So the idea is it's just with standard logic, right? You can question the premises. But yeah, if you're just going to throw garbage premises in, you're going to get garbage conclusions out. And that's true for Bayes' theorem. It's true for syllogistic logic. It's true for any statistics. It's true for any methodology whatsoever. And so that's the key thing, is that you do have to take it seriously and not use it as a device of deception. It is the logic of empirical reasoning, and you shouldn't be gaming it, right? You should be using it honestly and sincerely.
No, yeah, totally. And, I hear that complaint a lot of the time of like, well, you can just feed whatever numbers you want into it and you'll get whatever answer you want.
Which is literally true, but not relevant, right? That's like,
right.
Yeah, you can do that with anything, right? You can do that literally. You could just make up statistics and publish a paper that just made shit up. Yeah, of course you can do that. But we're not supposed to, right? Like, so like if we do that, you catch us and say, hey, you just made that shit up. Like, okay, got me. But if we're making an argument, it's not made up. Like we actually, this is how we collected our data. This is how we derived a frequency. So if you actually see the data and you see how we're deriving it, well, now there's something to argue about. It's not arbitrary, right? There's an anchor to reality, to empirical reality that you can argue over to derive and limit and constrain and alter your probabilities. And so it's all constrained to reality and to factual reality, facts and reality. And so if you're going to take it seriously, that's how you would critique a Bayesian argument, to say like, well, how are they deriving these probabilities? Do they say or do they not say? Well, if they don't say, maybe they are making it up, right? But if they say, then they're not making it up, they're deriving it. And if they're deriving it, are they deriving it from facts? Or are they deriving it without fallacy, etc.? It goes into standard critical thinking at that point, right? So now you can analyze their argument and the way why they're landing where they land on any argument that they have. And this is true for anybody, whether it's historians, philosophers, scientists, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, totally. I personally like using the Bayesian method because you can see how much weight people are putting on certain pieces of evidence, and that kind of highlights where they go wrong in their reasoning. And so that's what I really like about it.
Absolutely. And also how, ironically, the people who refuse not to use Bayesian reasoning are usually forgetting margins of error, right? They're picking a probability. They're not saying a number, but they're saying, well, I think this is way more likely than what you're saying. Yeah, well, okay. How much more likely and why? Why that much more likely? Like, how are you deriving that? And are you taking into account that you could be wrong? So like how far in either direction would you allow the probability to go? Like, what are your margins of error, right? Are you going to talk about this, or are you just going to hand wave, right? Like, and so I think a lot of people who don't like Bayes' theorem, there's that kind of two kinds of people. There's the ones who just scared of math, right? And they just don't want to take the effort to understand it. And then they'll come up with like rationalizations for why they don't use it or don't want to discuss it or learn it or whatever. And then there's people who are afraid of it, right? Because they want it to go away because it's scary. Once you start actually putting numbers to things, now you have to actually justify all of your beliefs and all of your assumptions about what's more likely than what else, and why is it twice as likely or 3 times as likely? Why are you saying it's so much more likely than something else? Like, you actually have to start answering these questions, and you might not have the answers, and then that might be a problem. And so I do think a lot of people want to get rid of Bayes' theorem because it actually is too probing. It is too critical. And which is the opposite of the critique that you're talking about, that it's arbitrary and therefore uncritical. No, it's the other way around, actually.
Yeah. I agree. That's why I've always thoroughly enjoyed Bayesian reasoning just in general. It really helped. It really satisfies the analytical part of my brain that I need that whenever I analyze somebody's argument. We do have a caller that's calling in. Are you ready to take a call?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I tested this beforehand. I'm really hoping that it works. And I appreciate everybody that's sending in super chats right now. We still need about 6 more super chats in order to do the extra Q&A afterwards with Dr. Carrier here. But all right, so we're going to get to our first caller, and hopefully, Rick, you can hear the caller as I take it. All right. Hi, caller. How you doing?
Hello. How's the audio?
Yeah, it sounds good.
All right. It's Mario. I have autism.
Yeah,
hi, Mario.
Good. Hi, Mario. How you doing?
All right.
Okay. Did you have a Bayesian question for Dr. Carrier here?
At the risk of sounding ridiculous, I was wondering if he was interested in talking about the connection between Bayesian inference and the yin and yang.
Oh, yeah. Not on this episode. This episode, we'd like to get to showing people concrete examples of using Bayesian reasoning. I wouldn't even know where to go with the metaphysics of yin and yang and Bayes' theorem. I think it would get too off topic.
All right.
Yeah. So are you saying that like you can use Bayesian reasoning to determine like something about yin and yang, like I guess actions and consequences?
Well, what it is a representation of shade on a mountain.
What? I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be
Yeah, I'm not exactly hearing or following. So I don't know what to do with this. Yeah. What we need is a fact claim about reality.
Right. Is there any
hypothesis about what exists?
Yeah. Is there, Mario, is there any way that you could possibly form this in like a factual claim?
Well, okay. Were there Bayesian odds to calculate the probability of Kamala winning Texas?
Yeah, in fact, that's the pollsters who are trying to do that. Were doing it. All pollsters now are using Bayesian reasoning. But I actually wrote on this, not related to the Bayesian question, but related to the polls question. Like last week, I think. One of the critical thinking examples I gave was polling. The problem with the polling, of course, is that all our results, all the polls, were within their margin of error. So the overlap was within margin of error. So basically, the statistics were useless. We simply had no accurate ability to predict the election at all because the votes were so close and the polling methods are so, well, right now, compromised. It's very difficult to get reliable data. So the results were fuzzy, and they were so fuzzy that they were just completely blurred, and there was no way to tell who the winner was. And I know that's not the way it gets reported in the press, but that's why I wrote that article about you really need to understand how poll numbers are used and generated and misrepresented. So when they say, Kamala Harris is up by 1 percentile, that's basically the same thing as saying we have no idea because the margin of error is ±3. So a difference of 1 is meaningless. Like, it doesn't tell us anything at all. This is actually one of the things I wanted to point out about Bayesian reasoning. And if we get to I don't know what we want to do, the Matt Kovacs thing that John had suggested off back channel. But this is a thing that he gets wrong as well, which is that when you pick margins of error, that means that you don't know what the answer is between those two margins. So you can't pick the middle, you can't pick the top, you can't pick the bottom. So really you have to pick the one that's the lowest, the one most against what you're hoping for, because that's the best you can hope for, because you literally don't know where the number is between the margins. So if the difference between Kamala Harris and Trump is predicted somewhere to be 1 percentile and the margin of error is plus minus 3, that's a 6 percentile range. The difference of 1 is useless. Like it tells you nothing about who's going to win, because it has to fall on the margin of error. So if it's 1, it's plus minus 3. So it's actually minus, so minus 2 up to plus 4, right? So minus 2 means she's 2 below him, is in the margin. So that means the poll data actually would completely agree with that being the case, that she was 2 below. And you have to accept that with margins of error. And I know it's scary. People don't like ambiguity and uncertainty, but that's the reality. Like if your margin of error says between one and another, you can't settle on what's in between. All you know is it's somewhere in between. It could be the worst. Could be the worst number that's in there. Could be the truth, because that's what the data tells you when the data is not detailed and accurate enough for you to be sure. And we might, if we do the Kovacs example, I might be able to show another example so that people can triangulate what I'm saying on that.
Yeah, totally. And if we run out of colors, or we run out of or anything like that, we can definitely address the Kovacs thing. I know that you aren't really wanting to focus on that too much, and we are.
Yeah, until I read it, and it's so funny.
I think it's funny that you can't actually see the post. Like that has its own ramifications.
Okay, that's weird. I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know what's that's me. That's a problem with maybe he's blocked me or something. But
yeah.
But no, like even it's just a travesty of bad. Like his arithmetic is wrong, his Bayesian calculation is incorrect. But also, not only even given the false equation he gives, his arithmetic is wrong. It's just like. And that's even like that was the worst of it. When I got to other things, there was other things wrong with it that I could just go item by item that are a problem. But point being is one of the mistakes that he made is this idea of margins of error, that you can just pick which one you want, the top of the margin or the bottom of the margin, or pick the middle. No, you don't. If your margin is -2 to +4. Kamala Harris, then that's all you know. It could be -2. It's just as likely it's -2 as +4, or 1, which is what gets reported, right? The 1 gets reported, but people don't realize that that's actually a range, and they're just arbitrarily picking the middle of the range. And we have zero information that says that that's more likely than the bottom of the margin or the top of the margin, etc. Right. So if you're going to say that there's margins of error, you are committing to saying that you do not know where the probability falls within the margins you've chosen. And that's an error I think a lot of people make, is that they think they can pick a margin of error and then just forget it and just pick a number in between whichever one they want, and then run with it. And that's not how probability works. So we can't do that. And that's also, by the way, why I keep saying that my conclusion on the historicity of Jesus was not 2% chance that Jesus existed. It was 1 in 3, like 33% chance Jesus existed. And the reason I say that is because the top margin is like as likely to be true. Like I all I can say is that it's not higher than 33. I cannot say that it's lower than 33. I can say that it's probably not less than 2%, but that's all the 2% represents. It's like that's the lowest it could be, but that's not my result, right? My result is really the 1 in 3, because in terms of what goes against the consensus assumption, the top of the margin is the highest chance, and that's the one that we want to look at. It's like is that result weird or not? Now, if someone's doing like historicity and they come up with 89%, but then their bottom margin is 40%, well, then they have to admit that Jesus might not have existed, right? Because the one against them is below 50%, right? So we have to take margins of error seriously and use them correctly. And I see a lot of critics of Bayesian reasoning forgetting that.
Yeah. So Mario, did we answer your question sufficiently?
Well, I feel like if you're trying to analyze the electorate in a truly Bayesian way, I think that would involve more listening to them rather than just trying to figure them out.
Well, that's how polls are generated,
makes
right?
sense.
Is that you go and ask them. So you are listening to them. The data is exactly that. What limits polls is access. So who are you asking? Who are you not asking? Like, who aren't you reaching? Who are you asking? How honest are they being when they answer? Like, those are things that can affect poll results. And that's where the margins of error come from, is calculating for that. So it is asking them. And if simply the question is, who are you going to vote for? So you want to figure out where's the popular vote going to end up, like we know now. But like, if you're trying to predict it, then you just go and ask everyone, literally everyone. Like, just but you can't ask everyone, right? So what you do is you do a random sample. That gets to the mathematics of why random samples are predictive. But is your sample random? That's a big problem with polls lately. I think there's something that went wrong with the Iowa poll, for example, on that I think they did not have proper randomization. Anyways, that kind of thing. So that's all the technicalities of statistics. And here I really want to just educate on Bayesian reasoning, where you don't have to do the heavy statistics. You don't need a mathematical computer model of voting data to answer a question, where we're just reasoning out, like, what does it mean to think about prior probability? What do we mean by likelihoods and so on? How can this tool be useful without having to do detailed math, just using the logic? And that's what I would hope to teach today.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Mario. Well, we do have other callers in the queue, so we want to get to them.
Cool.
Is there anything last that you want to say?
Well, I hope there are lessons we can learn from Kamala getting over 10 million less votes than Biden.
I mean, I think that has more to do with Democrats, for one reason or another, deciding not to vote. So I definitely think that it's a problem with the mindset of a lot.
I haven't looked into that, so I don't know what I'm sure there's tons of smart articles written by people who study the data who will have answers to that. But that's not something I know enough to talk about today, because I haven't looked into the literature on that.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what the solution is or what the reasons are or anything like that. But I know that it's just whatever mindset people had to not vote, that's what they went with. So, Mario, really appreciate you calling in and everything like that. And I hope that you'll call again in the future.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to Richard's takedown of Chrissy's paper.
Oh, I assume the Gregor. We're talking about Camille Gregor.
Yeah, Camille and Chrissy Hansen. I don't know. Are you planning on doing anything with that?
Yeah, I've got something in the works, a couple things, but yeah. So nothing to report just yet. I don't want to like hijack this stream on just that. So
no, I understand. I am very interested in your response, because I read it. I read both of the papers that they put out, and I was not impressed by it. But I'm interested to hear your take on it. But anyways,
yeah.
Mario, great to have you call in, and I'll talk to you later. Okay.
All right.
See you later, Mario.
Great call. Bye.
Bye. All right. So we're almost at our 10. Maybe I put this too low. We're almost at our 10 super chat goal here. I do want to bring up Michael Beverly real quick. Super chat. If you buy a lotto ticket with this money, you'll be making Bayesians the world over cry like babies.
Yeah, I don't want to like digress too much on that, but actually, I think opposition to buying lottery tickets is philosophically misguided. The hostility to lottery tickets is often based on a simple calculation, the gambling calculation. But this is an example of, and it gets into values more than like empirical reality, right? So empirically, yeah, the odds of winning a lottery are super low. But the thing is if you're playing a public lottery, what you're doing is voluntarily taxing yourself more. Right, because that money goes to two things: one, advertising, which is the payouts, and public goods. Right, because a lot of that stuff goes to actual public till, and it's actually paying for services. So buying lottery tickets is not inherently bad. Like, if you just voluntarily choose to tax yourself, pay a little bit more in taxes, and in return for that, the government will throw your number in a wheel and see if you get something out of it. That's reasonable. Buying lottery tickets only becomes a problem when you are buying so much that it's actually hurting you economically, right? So, so if you're overtaxing yourself, if you're taxing yourself into poverty, then it's bad. But buying a lottery ticket once a week is not really. For the average person, it's not going to hurt you economically. It's a question of, do I want to buy a hamburger, or do I want to like throw some money into schools and roads for a chance it's payout. So I point being is like when you look at Bayes' theorem, and often the equations will leave out what's B or K, which is called background knowledge. Mathematicians will often leave that out because they say, well, we all know that's there, but most people don't know that's there. Every single term in Bayes' theorem is conditioned on B, which is background knowledge. And so if you're going to come to a conclusion about what should you do about buying lottery tickets, you actually do need to make sure that you're including all information and not just saying, oh, it's just going to a casino and playing a private lottery that the money goes to no one except some fat cat. That's not the same scenario, right? So you're leaving information out. And so I don't think, and I think that's the thing that Bayesians are very attuned to. So I don't think Bayesians would cry too much over a little bit of money being spent on a lottery tickets. They would cry over too much money being spent on a lottery ticket.
All right. And we have met our goal. So we'll do about 20 to 30 minutes after I had planned on us stopping at about 8 o'clock. So we'll go to about 8:30 and we'll do a little bit of extra Q&A. But I have started another goal to tack on a little bit more time to that. I don't expect us to meet it, but I taking into account what you said right before the show, Carrier, I felt like another 20 minutes maybe. After
sure.
that might be okay.
Yeah, you bet. Mm-hmm.
So keep those super chats coming in if you want to do some more Q&A with Carrier here. I will be going through more super chats as we go through the night, but we do have a few more callers in the queue, and I definitely want to get to them.
Yeah, let's hear them.
All right, so next up, hi there, caller. How you doing?
Is this Alfred?
This is
Hello?
not Alfred. This is John and Dr. Richard Carrier.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Dr. Carrier a few questions. I know he's a mythicist. Could I ask a few pertaining to that?
Sure.
Let's do that, but let's keep it to a few because we really want to do some Bayesian modeling here. I've done whole shows on the whole theory and all of that stuff, but I'd like to you can ask some questions, but we'll pick one of them and walk through it as a model. So let's. What are your questions? We can start with one of them.
Sure. So one impression when I'm reading the Gospels, I guess let's just stick with one Gospel, is Mark. He seems to, I don't think he has a Roman audience, but he seems to want to get along with Roman authorities. He wants to appease them, not antagonize them. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, insofar as the Gospels critique the Roman Empire at all, it's covertly, right? So this really comes from Paul. So I have an article on my blog on how Mark is actually reifying the epistles of Paul into stories. And Paul is the one who is very much don't worry about the Roman Empire. The authorities are chosen by God. The world's going to end soon anyway, so it doesn't matter. So he's very much the pacifist, not the critic of the elite government. And that gets translated into the Gospels. And of course, this also has something to do with which version of the religion got preserved. Obviously, the ones that the Romans weren't killing off entirely is the one that we get to read. And so that's a selection effect. But anyway, that doesn't really have much to do with the historicity of Jesus, though. Is there a question of fact that you have?
Well, I'm about to get to it. So
okay, yeah.
In Mark 15, you have this interesting picture where Jesus is brought before Pilate, and he finds Jesus. What is it? He finds no fault in him, and you have this Jewish mob pressuring they're a subject people pressuring a Roman official into, hey, crucify him. And Pilate finally gives in, and he gives the order for Jesus to be crucified. So my question is, if Jesus was a myth, if you're telling fiction, there's a lot of freedom, and if Jesus was a myth, then why didn't they just change the story to the Jews crucified Jesus? Why did they have to? It seems like they're trying to circumvent the blame. Like, yes,
So very
but the
quickly,
Jews were
very quickly, some Christians did. We actually have the version of Christianity that seems to have been popular east of the Roman Empire, that got mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud and in the writings of Epiphanius. They actually did teach that Jesus was stoned by the Jews. And they set the time of Jesus 100 years earlier than Pontius Pilate. They put him under Alexander Jannaeus, when a stoning by Jews made more sense. So if Jesus didn't exist, it looks to me like different, depending on which empire you're living under, whether the Sassanids or the Parthians or the Romans, then people were picking when to set Jesus and who to have kill him. Is it a collaboration between the Jews and the Romans, or are the Romans not even involved, and it's just the Sanhedrin? That choice is made based on where the myth is being told. Now, so to give you an example, in my book, I estimate the worst odds on this is that it makes no difference, that maybe it's just as likely that Christians invented the stoning by the Jews story as that they would invent the crucifixion story. So it doesn't tell us anything about whether Jesus existed. But in the worst case scenario, I estimate it's 2-to-1 odds that it's twice as likely that we would see this diversion, like setting Jesus in 100 years apart in two different myths, is more likely if there wasn't a Jesus, because then it's easier to set him wherever you want. And where you set him is going to be based on which empire you want to be commenting on, basically. And so that's why that happens, I think. And so anyway, so you can look at the difference between how do you explain this diversion between when Jesus is set and how he's described as killed. Why does that difference exist at all? Like, why were the Christians preaching that he wasn't crucified, that he was killed, or wasn't crucified by Romans, that he was stoned by the Jews and crucified by hanging of the corpse, which was actually a standard Jewish part of the Jewish execution procedure? And the same words applied to both. So Paul is unfortunately very vague. Paul never says the Romans killed Jesus. He says crucified, but the word is the same word used for Jewish executions. So Paul is very vague on this. And that's another issue that I bring up in my study. So if we were to nail this down to, let's say everything else is equal, let's say everything else is a wash, all the evidence that we have otherwise, it's just as likely to exist whether Jesus existed or not. And all we have is this one thing, apart from the fact that the Gospels are highly mythologized. And so let's walk through the app. John's got it up, and we start with the prior odds. So it's the first thing you see when you hit start in the app is you get to the prior odds. And here's there it is. And you go through that, and you can set the worst odds and the best odds. So the worst odds would be the lowest probabilities that you think Jesus existed. Best would be most optimistic for the historicity of Jesus. And is that an Android setup that you're running there?
Yeah, so I've got it running on an Android.
It's a lot more beautiful than the iOS. Okay, yeah, very good. So I set the worst odds at 1 in 15. So the 1 to 15. So the 15 goes in the bottom. And the reason I set it to that is that I compare him to other mythical heroes that he looks a lot alike. In fact, this sort of tragic mythic hero king narrative happens a lot. There's a ton of examples of it, and none of them existed. So that would make Jesus very unusual. He would be the only, in that model, it would be the only person who fits this matrix who existed. And so in my study, I set it to and there's a certain, I do the math, I count the number of examples and stuff, and the lowest we can get is 1 to 15. Now, that's the worst odds, which means that we can say that the odds are not worse than that, given what we know. But really, what everybody wants to know is the next odds, which is the best odds. What are the best odds?
Sorry, Rick, I don't mean to interrupt, but caller, 1 in 15 is roughly 6.67%. Do you have an issue with that at all?
Well, I'm sure he does, but because I haven't adequately explained the basis of it.
Right. Yeah. How do you feel
Uh,
about that starting off? I'm just curious.
Well, he kind of, he's referencing other Christians who believe Jesus was stoned. I mean, I've
We
never
haven't. Okay,
heard
good
of
point. We haven't gotten to that. We're going back. We're taking a step back, and we're going to start with just what is the prior probability before we ask the question of the different stories, which we'll get to, because that's evidence, and we'll get to evidence next. But first, we have to figure out what is the prior probability. Like, what is a guy like Jesus? How often do guys like Jesus turn out to actually have existed? And I find looking at the data
Aren't
that the
messianic prophets common at the time?
well, what I'm saying is that the
Aren't there like
Gospels
a lot of?
yeah, but the Gospels portray him as a very specific type of hero who does
Mhm.
very specific types of things that are very typical of these non-existent heroes. So he's not just a prophet; he's actually a highly mythologized superhero, and highly mythologized superheroes tended not to exist. So what I do is I estimate how frequently is that the case. Now the worst odds are 1 in 15. You don't have to believe that. What I find is the best odds are 1 in 2. Right? So 1 in 2 means that 1 out of every 3 of these guys existed. There's been other studies. This gets to the Gregor and Hansen studies where I think they make a case that the lower odds, the 1 in 15, should be higher. That I would correct those odds up higher. But I'm just describing what was in the study currently. But they don't do anything about the upper odds. So the higher odds, the top odds stay the same. Once you correct for other errors they make in set theory and things like that. But so I think the best odds are 1 in 2. And that means it's no more likely than that. It means 1 out of every 3 of these superheroes did exist. And so that's the prior odds on Jesus being just like any of these other superheroes. It's 1 in 3 chances. Basically, if you think of it as if you put Jesus and all these other guys in a hat and jumble it up at random and you pull one out at random, what is the probability that you would have picked a historical person? And the answer is 1 in 3, given the data, right, at best. And so that's before we look at the evidence. And the evidence could change this completely. And you could say, like, let's suppose Alexander the Great is in the hat and you pull him out. Well, he's got a prior probability of 1 in 3 of existing in that case. But there's so much evidence for Alexander the Great that it completely changes those odds, right? So it ends up being like millions to 1 that he existed. So that's why you start with the prior. You have to like figure out and justify your priors, your lower odds, your upper odds for the prior probability. And that's why the basic idea is that because Jesus starts out as a super mythologized person, even in the letters of Paul, he belongs to a class of people who tended not to exist. That does not itself prove that he didn't exist, because we have to go look at the evidence and see, is he an exception? Is he one of these 1 out of 3 guys who did exist? Is he one of them or not? And that's when you look at the evidence. And we're going to assume for now that there's no evidence to answer that question by except this one thing that we have. And so the worst odds here, I set at 1 to 2. And that's because I think it's twice as likely, at least twice as likely, that these 2 different stories would arise if he didn't exist. It's harder for Christians to completely relocate Jesus 100 years earlier and have him stoned by Jews if there was a real story of him being crucified by the Romans in the 1st century AD. Like, if that was the story, how did they change it? Like, it's harder. It's not impossible. Very important to note. It's not impossible. It's just harder. So I put it at 1 and 2. So the worst odds, 1 to 2 for that. Yeah, he's trying to work it out. You got it there? Can you do the worst on the worst? Oh, name the evidence. Yes, good point.
Right. So this is the evidence screen. What we have are total worst and total best up top.
And that's just for the evidence, which we haven't looked at yet. So
right. Yeah. And so this is our first piece of evidence that we're talking about here. And so you're saying 1 and 2 for this.
And let's name the evidence.
Right?
So show people, if you click that, you can change it from the word evidence. You can change it to, let's say, what I call the twin traditions. We'll call it the twin traditions. That there's 2 different versions of this. And it's harder to explain the 2 traditions if Jesus existed. Not impossible, just a little bit harder. Okay, now I can't remember what I did in the study. I think it's 1 to 1 for best, meaning this has no effect, that it's just as likely whether Jesus existed or not, that they would change the story in that way. So what we have is worst and best. maybe I did it somehow different in the study, but let's just say that this is how I did it. Perhaps this is one way to do it. Maybe someone else will do it this way, even if it's not the way I did it. So we do worst and best, and then let's assume that's the only evidence we have. And then you click results, and it gives us the probabilities that Jesus existed. Worst 3%, best 34%. Now the reason it's low is because the evidence is because the prior probability was starting around 33% already. So the effect of this evidence is basically nil based on our prior is basically saying, well, he tends to be like other mythical people. We have no really conclusive evidence. So even my estimating that evidence as being evidence against the historicity of Jesus didn't really change the numbers very much, because I estimated it to be pretty weak as evidence against the historicity of Jesus. Now we can keep adding evidence. Let's jump back and let's add another evidence. Let's add something similar to what he was thinking. So let's say, let's call this political plausibility, if there's room to say all that in there, because this is a common way of putting this, is that depicting Jesus crucified by the Romans, the argument goes like this, that depicting Jesus crucified by the Romans doesn't make sense if he didn't exist. Like, who would make that up, right? Like, it seems like surely that it must have really happened, otherwise who would come up with it? And let's say we're going to score this. Now I'm going to score it in a way that is not the way I would score it at all, but I'm going to just show what happens if we score it the way I think you would score it. So if you think like the worst against your position is worst case scenario, what would you think are the odds that would be invented if Jesus didn't exist? And I don't mean like the odds you think they are, but the odds that are like the best odds of that happening. That like what try to argue as much against yourself as possible. How far against yourself can you believe it to be the odds for this to have happened, that Jesus didn't exist and yet they invented a crucifixion of him anyway? Can you like ballpark it? And we can talk about why you pick the number you do, but or do you feel like you have no sense at this point of how to do that?
You're asking me?
Yeah, yes.
I don't.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't think the Christian communities were centralized. Kind of like you pointed out, there was some out there community that thought he was stoned to death. So what you would have to do is basically, it looks to me, tell me where I'm wrong, you need some kind of conspiracy of different Christian groups coming together to falsify history. And I mean, conspiracies happen, they really do.
That would be a different, that would be a different argument, the conspiracy argument. So you wouldn't need the conspiracy argument, but we could do that too. But let's stick to the first one. You're saying that the idea that no one would invent this, right? Like who would come up with the idea that Jesus was crucified? How likely do you think that would be? Like, just ballpark a probability that Jesus doesn't exist, but some crazy Christian came up with the story anyway and everybody believed him. Like, what would you say the probability is of that?
Yeah, like let's say on a scale of like maybe 1 to 5, with 1 being incredibly unlikely and 5 being incredibly likely, where would you place this on that scale?
Yeah, we're asking the caller.
Yeah.
Just a little bit above 1, and I don't see why an entire community would go with this person's story. Or could you explain how that would work?
I see. Yeah, okay. 1 on the scale of 1 to 5. So like, would you say 10% chance, like a 1 in 10 chance that someone would make this up? Do you think that's reasonable?
I'd say it's, let's say 30 or 40% chance that someone would make it up. I find it highly improbable that you'd have early Christian communities.
Hold on, caller.
Yeah, actually, no, this
I'm so
is good.
sorry. Well, I was just gonna say, like, that's incredibly more than a 1. Like,
yeah, I was gonna ask. You said incredibly unlikely, but then said 40%.
Yeah, I changed my opinion.
I see.
Yeah,
okay. Well, yeah. Would you say 40% is like the most? That's the highest odds that it could be, highest probability that it could be. Is no way it's more likely than 40%. Would that be an accurate representation of where you're at?
It could be higher. I'm just kind of shooting in the dark. 47.
Okay. No, that's fair. So we want to model this. So 40 would be 4 to 5, right? Or
Okay.
wait, am I doing that right?
Well,
Is that
it
right?
looks
No,
like
I
Someone
think
do the
that's
math.
it looks
for me
like
real
it's
quick.
6-4.
Okay, yeah.
So
Shit, am I doing that
3
right?
to 2? Or wait, is that right? Would 3 to 2
40,
be right?
4 to 5. I thought it was 40. So if it's 40%, and it would be, oh, you're right. It would be 40%, 60%. So it would be 2 to 3.
2 to 3.
Is that right? Am I doing that right? Whoever, anybody in the audience in the comments, I'm trying to do arithmetic in my head real quick, and I'm not succeeding very well. Yeah, because 2 parts out of 3, right? Because it's 4, 3, 4, 5. No, it's
I'm really
2,
bad
2,
at odds
3.
form. So
Yeah, I know. Me too. They're trying to convert them from one to the other. I'm off the top of my head. Let's just say it's that. No, actually, no, that's too high. Hold on. It's got to be 40% to 50%. No, 40% to 60%. So it's 4 to 6. So that's 2 to 3. No, we're right. Okay. No, that seems wrong. I'm doing the math wrong.
I thought it was
40,
3 to 2, but I might be wrong.
4 out of 10. 4 out of 10. 4 out of 10. It's 4 to 10. There we go. Okay, yeah, I knew I was getting myself hung up on this. Okay, so make it easy. It's 4 to 10.
Nope, not 310.
Is that right? Now I'm doubting myself. 40%. What gets you 40%? All right, let me see if I can quickly figure this out.
Let's see.
It's odds. Let's see if there's an AI will help me here. 6, 4, 4, 6. So I guess it is 4, 6. It is 4, 6. No, 4, 6.
Yeah,
it is 4, 6.
2 to 3.
Yeah, so I was right.
2 to 3.
I was right the whole time. That just felt wrong to me. Like, okay, no, but it is correct. Yeah, okay. I was just arguing myself out of being correct.
I've got an odds probability calculator pulled up, so I can easily.
No, it's 2 to 3. Okay, so there is a way to quickly translate those. So, like, if you do 40, yeah. So yeah, well, yeah. There's a way to do it, but anyway. 6 to 2, 2 to 3 is the thing. No, 2 to 3 that's the worst. That should be the best. Let's put that as the best, not as the worst. Because I'll explain in a moment. Like, that's the best odds. We're ballparking it here. Best odds 2 to 3.
Okay.
Worst odds, though, it's got to be worse, like 10% or something. Like, it's very unlikely. We'll just say we'll stick with the very unlikely. What is the lowest probability you can reasonably believe it is that they would come up with this? And I get from the way you're speaking that you would put it pretty low, and I think that's fine. That we want to model how you're thinking. So let's just do 1 to 10, right? Or is it 10 to 1? 10 to 1.
Let's see.
It's evidence
one.
So.
Right. Well, I mean, that 1 to 9 would be 10% of being true.
Yeah, but it would be 9 to 1 because it's evidence 4, right?
Right. Okay. So 9 to.
Yeah, you want the numbered on top to be big if it's evidence for something. You want it to be bigger than the one below.
Okay.
And there we go. So now we've got 2 things. So scan up. Let's see the last thing that we had. The other evidence. It's still there for the twin traditions. So we're allowing the twin traditions to count slightly against the historicity of Jesus. But now we're weighting political plausibility of the crucifixion story a lot in favor of the historicity of Jesus. And so we're going to see what the effect, because both things are true at the same time. So you have to take them both into account. And we're going to see now, if you hit results, it's going to combine this with the prior odds that we figured later, and it comes up with this. Now, the reason it hasn't moved much is because the prior odds are starting low. The numbers don't look right to me here. We've done something wrong.
So the 1 to 9 for winning, the 1 to 9 for it being true would be like for the worst, that would be 90%. The 9.
You're right.
9 to 1
you're right.
that represents 90%.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's it. It's 1 to 9. It's unlikely. That's right. It's unlikely. Right. There you go. Yes. Very good. See, that's how we do this. 1 to 9. Now it's going to come out. No, that's still wrong. No, go back.
0%. Caller loses.
No, that can't be right. Okay, so I didn't go back. What are we doing wrong? Worst odds. No, I think we were right. Right? It's 9 to 1. It should be 9 to 1. Yeah, absolutely should be 9 to 1.
Like 9
to 1.
I
know why. I know what's
worst?
happening. Yeah, it's the worst evidential odds combined with the worst prior probability.
Right.
So
So
I think
our
that's what
worst,
we're
let's
getting.
see, our worst prior probability is 1 to 15,
Yeah.
right? So we come over
Yeah.
here
So
to our
let's
evidence.
change that just to show what I'm talking about. Let's go back and set it to the same. Make the worst and the best the same. So make them both 1 to 2.
Okay.
And then we'll see. So we're going to assume that this is 1 to 2.
Right.
That's the prior odds we've done. Oh, wait, now it's 1 to 18. How did that happen?
Well, no, so this is the total of the evidence. This is the
Oh,
total.
it's the total.
of
Yes,
the
you're right.
evidence,
Absolutely. Okay.
Right.
Oh, it
So
should
we
be
got 1
9
to
to
18
1. That's
for
right.
worst.
Now it's 9
Yeah.
to 1. So change the second one to 9 to 1. Yeah.
This one to 9 to 1.
Yes, 9 to 1 in favor of historicity, right? Because that's the top number should be higher. Okay, now let's hit the final result. Yeah, see, now the odds have gotten way better for Jesus. So let's go down and hit results. Okay, now we got that right. So given that, if we assume the prior probability is 1 in 3, so 1 to 2, but it's 1 in 3. 1 in 3 guys of these kinds of guys don't exist. But we have that argument, the evidence of the crucifixion. It's so unlikely that anybody would make that up. When you factor that in, it actually not only cancels out the evidence of the twin traditions that we were using as evidence against historicity, but it also overwhelms the prior. So we end up with the worst odds of 69%. I don't know why the best is still reading that way. 25. There's something wrong there. But it did update the worst odds correctly.
Well, yeah. So the worst is 69, but the best being 2 of 3, and then this one, the best.
I see.
Is
When you,
1 of
yeah, you're right.
1.
When you're combining the bad evidence with the good evidence, it's not strong enough at the top end. Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
yeah. So basically, the political plausibility, the 9 to 1 worst, is saying that it's 90% likely, that it would be politically plausible, and then or politically implausible, and then best here would be the 2 to 3 that it is politically plausible,
Yes.
that it would be made up. Or
90% implausible that they would invent it. Yes, that's the right way to say it.
So this is showcasing how if it was 90% implausible or incredibly implausible that they would make it up, then you would get.
Yeah, you're right. So
result.
we really, the 9 to 1 should be in the best odds category, and then the worst odds should be no, that's
2 to
still
3.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, no, that it should be the other way around, right? 2 to 3 should be in the worst column, and then 9 to 1 that'll get it correct. Because this is where the evidence is counting the most that it can for Jesus. 9 to 1 odds, like it's making it 9 times more likely that they would come up with the crucifixion if it was real than if Jesus didn't exist. And that's what we get when you do it the other way around. Now, notice our bottom estimate is still too low. So we're not certain that Jesus existed. You're still not certain that he existed. Our margin of error crosses from both doesn't exist, does exist. So this is kind of like the polls before the election. Like we have no data, really. We just can't determine whether Jesus existed or not with this information. We need something better. And I've done talks about like the kind of evidence we have for Hannibal or Spartacus or even Pontius Pilate. They're things that are like thousands to 1 in favor of his existing, hundreds to 1, super good odds because the evidence is so clear cut. Now let's go back to the question. So I just wanted to like pick one example. I know we can't get into all the issues of historicity. We can't even get into all the issues of this one single thing we measured here, which is the political plausibility argument. But I just wanted to use it as a model to show like this is how modeling your reasoning, the caller's reasoning here. Like this is, we can show with Bayes' theorem like what's going on in their head in terms of why they think this is convincing evidence. Now, I think it isn't at all convincing evidence. That there's actually really good reasons that they would invent the crucifixion. And certainly at best, I mean, at worst, even Stephen odds that they would. And I go into this in my study on the historicity of Jesus. Don't have time to go into that here today. But I have whole sections, chapters on the background evidence. And when we start looking at the fact that there's evidence, a lot of evidence, that the Jews were expecting a dying Messiah, that the crucifixion of Jesus satisfied certain theological needs of the Christians, that doesn't require him to have actually been killed by the Romans. And once you see the context, you see that it's not as unlikely that they would invent this. But that does require digging, like going in detail over the context. There's a lot of issues of the context as to why inventing a self-sacrificing hero made complete sense, specifically in this time of the Jewish turmoil. That it actually was fitting their prophecies, it was fitting their expectations. It had a lot of tremendous uses. So there's actually, the context doesn't actually make it unlikely once you know the context, but that does require getting aware of the context. If we didn't have that context, then we'd be, I think, where the caller is, where these numbers came out, right? And so that's what we'd be looking at. And then, of course, we'd want to see if there's other evidence that can stack more in their direction. Because if we got, let's say, 2 pieces of evidence that were this good, it would have a huge effect in increasing the odds that Jesus existed, especially on the lower margin. Or it should be 2 to 3, by the way, not 9 to 1. 2 to 3.
Oh yeah. So the best is 2 to 3.
The worst is 2 to 3. The worst is 2 to 3. Oh. Remember, because we're swapping them. The worst is 2 to 3, and the best is 9 to 1, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I thought you were wanting to change like the.
Oh, I see. And then check the results again. I want to make sure that this didn't. Okay, yeah. No. So it's still too low. So we need more evidence to be sure. But now we're getting, like, if this actually tracked, like these numbers really made sense in the context and stuff, it really was that improbable. Then we'd be looking at, like, the odds are getting above 50% on the upper margin, which is better than I got, right, in my study. And so if you keep stacking evidence like that, you could get the lower margin to just creep up above 50% as well. And that's when you start to get to, like, where we get with Hannibal and Pontius Pilate and other historical figures, where the evidence is much better than this. Like, this is kind of weak evidence. The twin traditions is even weaker. The way I measured it. So it's even weaker evidence against, and this is the political plausibility is weak evidence for, but not nearly as weak as the evidence against that I presented. So you can see how using this calculator and estimating these odds and not making the mistakes that we made of figuring it out, you can actually model your own thinking, and then you can start toying with these numbers to see what would it take. Like, how good of an evidence does it need to be? 10 to 1 odds? Does it need to be 10 times more likely? How many of those kinds of pieces of evidence? Like, we need 3 pieces of evidence. Each one is 10 times more likely if Jesus existed than if he didn't. What would be the effect of that? And you can do this. You can keep adding. If you look, I don't know if people caught when John added the extra evidence, but you can hit the plus at the bottom and keep adding items of evidence, item of evidence. So let's not rename this one. Let's just put this 10 to 1, 10 to 1 in both boxes, just to make it easy so we don't get too complicated. So we're going to get another good piece of evidence. This is a good piece of evidence because it's 10 to 1, a very narrow margin of error. And let's see what that does. See, now it's Jesus existed, right? So that's all you need is, like, a piece of evidence like that. And so that's.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah, please, by the way.
This is gonna sound sarcastic, but I don't mean it at all. Like,
sure.
How much percent of the audience do you think right now understands what you're saying? Understands this?
Yeah, it's hard to say. So it depends on what audiences come here. I think we didn't introduce the calculator enough for people to get where we're coming from here. But remember, this is the chat for this calculator. So the idea was for people to come here to learn the calculator. But yeah, I got a little garbled in there, so it was difficult for me to illustrate it. But I'm trying to get to that point, but I've not succeeded yet.
Yeah. So basically, what we're trying to highlight here is that when you actually walk out the thinking that you're providing in suggesting these things, like when you actually walk out the actual calculations on it, you get results that are different than what you might expect. So if I can, I want to erase that particular piece of evidence that we got. Sure. Carrier, what would be your worst case scenario for this political plausibility?
Yeah, so do I even have a number for that? I think I wash it out as 1 to 1 on both top and bottom. Because the context, there's nothing improbable about it. Like, it's equally balanced in terms of, like, how likely would they come up with this if he did exist or if he didn't exist. So, I mean, like, if he did exist, it's like 100%. but the death isn't necessarily, right? So it comes down to the question of the specific mode of execution, right? So let me give an example. Like if Paul had said the Romans executed or crucified Jesus, now there's a passage in First Thessalonians where he says the Jews did, but the majority consensus currently is that that's an interpolation, and I think the evidence is super strong that Paul never wrote that. But that would be interesting if he thinks the Jews killed. It's 1 Thessalonians 2, 13 to 16, where he credits the Jews for killing Jesus. But the Romans, but suppose that passage said the Romans, like he said the Jews through the Romans killed Jesus. Now, if he'd said that, I would set the odds against that even bigger than we just did, right? So I would say like the probability of that being there and Jesus still not existing would be so low that that would just decide the question, basically.
Yeah, let's model that out. So
yeah,
we've got.
I would say and we're assuming that there's no evidence that it's interpolated, right? So we can't dismiss the evidence. Like we don't have evidence that the passage was written by someone other than Paul. If we don't have that evidence, so we could say like, it's the same. We know the rate of interpolation is like 1 in 200 verses or something, so it's very low. So we can disregard that possibility. If he wrote it and there's no evidence that he didn't write that, then I would say it's 100 to 1. I would put it somewhere in the vicinity of 100 to 1, even at worst odds. I'd say maybe 10 to 1 worst odds, or is that best odds? Wait a minute, I'm getting confused between them.
So here's worst odds 10 to 1.
10 to 1, best odds 100 to 1. Yeah.
100 to 1.
There we are.
There we go. All right.
So the worst, the
results
weakest.
would be?
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And so that's why this shows that the reason in my study, and of course this will make more sense if you read the study and get to where we've literally just jumped into the middle of the ocean and trying to swim without any background. But in my study, it's key to note that there is no reference to the Romans crucifying Jesus. And so once you accept the hypothesis that Paul's going around, and this is the hypothesis, this isn't a fact, but it's the hypothesis. If you accept the hypothesis that Paul is going around saying the devil crucified Jesus in the air, in the lower heavens, then the probability that all these Christians would do all of this stuff then makes sense. The reason they would map it onto Romans when they mythologize it makes sense, and so on. So the probability it's not as improbable in that case once you grant that hypothesis. And then of course you could challenge the hypothesis and things like that. But the fact that the word Romans is nowhere in there, nothing historicizing is in Paul. In fact, he never places the crucifixion on earth. He never assigns it to a historical person doing it. He's never specific about who crucified.
Wasn't it just accepted?
Sorry, what was that?
Based on what though? You're talking about the Gospels? Because that's decades later. It's a lifetime later. The first time we ever hear of the Romans crucifying Jesus is in.
The Gospels?
Say again. Oh, when do we date the Gospels? In my study, I follow the mainstream dating, which is 70s for Mark as the first. Yeah, 70s for Mark is the first. Late 70s is what I personally think is likely. Early 80s at the latest. For Mark, Matthew's 80s or 90s. Luke is definitely late 90s, could be as late as 115. There's a lot of scholars now siding with that position. John is much later. John is our redaction of John is like 140 or something. It's really late.
Wow.
But the first time we hear of Jesus being crucified by Romans is Mark. So even First Clement, even Hebrews, which I both date to the 60s, I date them before the Jewish War. Neither of them have ever heard it, seem never to have heard of this. They don't mention it. So the idea of it being mapped onto the Romans comes with the first myth, the first mythic's tale written of Jesus. And that's always suspect. So when you look at all the earlier documentation, that claim is nowhere in there. That's the problem. And that's why the numbers come out differently in my study than I showed here. Like if Paul had said the Romans killed Jesus, and this would be a non-starter, like the idea that somehow he's speaking in code or somehow he misheard or something like that, or he's making it up and selling the false tale, those become increasingly less likely.
Is there really that much ambiguity when he's? I know we're relying on translations when he says Christ crucified. I think he says it several times. Is there really that much ambiguity? Like he was strung up or something?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my study, I cite several other studies by scholars who literally have devoted entire studies to the question of crucifixion and the words that are used. So there's actually more than one. There's like several studies that have found that the words are the same. And in fact, you could find the exact same words in the Old Testament for a lot of people being killed by the Jews, right? So, or by other people, not the Romans, right? So the Old Testament doesn't have Romans in it. But the same word is used for the same words, I should say, are used for crucifixion. And the word actually just means staked. It's that vague. It doesn't say staked while alive. It doesn't say staked after death. It's just staked, and it can be impaled. It can be hung up. It can be hung on a tree. It can be hung on a plank. Like it's super ambiguous as to what is actually being referred to.
Also,
and
I know
that's part of the context, that people don't know this context. And when you know the context, then things start to change your perspective on what's going on. And that's how my study ended up coming to a different conclusion than most people do.
Yeah, Carrier, also, I know that in the past you've mentioned that this is kind of a masked man fallacy, but I feel like Paul calling him, only really knowing him as like Christ or whatnot, knowing him by that title, I feel like that kind of works against like the historicist argument. But I think that in the past you've told me that that's more of a masked man fallacy, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure the masked man fallacy part of it, but I wouldn't use that argument. I don't think it's true that because Paul certainly believes Jesus is a space alien. Like, he's going around preaching that this guy lives in outer space and is talking to me with secret codes and stuff. But that doesn't mean Jesus didn't exist, right? Because people believe that about historical people. Like, lots of people believe someone who's historical flew up into outer space and is now communicating with them from beyond. Like, that's, lots of people believe that of historical people. So the fact that Paul's going around thinking that Jesus, the Savior, Christ, the Messiah, and all of this, the fact that that's all he knows him as, that's not evidence against his existing, because that's just as likely if he was some sort of guru who is deified than if he was someone only known celestially, right? Only known through revelations and dreams. And we don't have any smoking gun like that in Paul. Like, Paul doesn't say, for example, we have only ever heard from Jesus in Revelations, right? Like he never says this like that would be like a slam dunk for mythicism, right? That would just disprove historicity, slam dunk. But no, he's always vague. And part of this is selection bias. We only have a small fraction of the letters of Paul, and historicists decided which letters we get to see, and also doctored some of them and forged some of them. So we have a lot of selection bias. Paul might have actually been very plain about the devil crucified Jesus in the air. But if he was, that letter disappeared and we don't get to read it. It's also possible he never said that this was something only communicated secretly, orally, and not something that he would write down, or didn't have an occasion to write down, because his letters are all occasional. He's responding to particular arguments that are being posed at him. He's not writing a treatise on Christianity. Anyway, that's a digression.
Does the mythicist hypothesis require some kind of cover up?
No, there's no cover up. Yeah, no. I think maybe what you're wondering
said that they destroyed or tampered with.
No.
I thought I heard they tampered with letters that.
No, it doesn't require it. It's just a fact, right? So it's a background fact, so it affects our estimates of probabilities. That fact in and of itself is no more likely whether Jesus existed or not, because they destroyed this stuff even if Jesus existed, right? The fact whether he existed or not does not make this more or less likely that they destroyed half the letters of Paul. They did it anyway. Either way, they did it. So what it does do is it means that we can't argue that we should have a letter from Paul saying something that the people who selected the canon wouldn't like. We can't expect that, because they might have gotten rid of that. So in other words, we can't make an argument from silence on that kind of thing. But that's not an argument against historicity. It's just the lack of an argument for historicity. And those aren't the same thing. Bayes' theorem helps you see the difference between those two kinds of arguments. But no, and there's no organized conspiracy either, because the people who are selecting the canon we're a jumble of people at odds with each other, and it's 100 years later, right? Like they're not even the same people that started the religion. So like people in the time of Paul are completely different Christians than 100 years later, right? So there's no like sustained conspiracy from the time of Paul all the way up to the 2nd century to invent Jesus and cover up any evidence. Right? Yeah. I mean, it's not impossible, but you would put odds against it, right? Like I would too, right? And in fact, I talk about that in the early chapters of On the Historicity of Jesus, that there are some of these, the idea that the myth was invented in Paul's lifetime is too unlikely to believe, right? So like that I think would count against mythicism. If you had to do that, if you had to say, oh, Paul, like if Paul said the Romans crucified Jesus and you came and said, oh, well, he's promoting the mythicist myth of the execution of Jesus, like that doesn't actually make historical sense. It would make historical sense a generation later for someone to do that. But it makes no sense, like after the Jewish War and everything, but that makes no sense for Paul to be doing that. That would be very unlikely. And that's why that would, if Paul said it, that would be much stronger evidence for historicity than anything we have. I hope that answered your question. I know that was a bit meandering and confusing, but
yeah. So caller, we do have a couple of other callers to get to. No, and we do have some other callers to get to, and maybe I can have Carrier on maybe sometime in December or January to like actually take some calls on mythicism and whatnot. But
yeah, I would love
we
to
do have
something,
a couple of other callers to get to, and we've only got about 45
I'm hoping somebody
minutes
will have
left.
something on something else, right? Like just, it doesn't have to be Jesus. It could be literally anything. Like did oil companies destroy an invention in which cars that run on water? Like we could do a Bayesian analysis of that. We could do the prior odds and so on. It doesn't have to be Jesus stuff. It could even be God stuff too. I use Bayes' theorem on theology all the time.
Right. So caller, I do appreciate you calling in. We do need to get to a couple of other people, but do you have any kind of last words for us? Yeah.
Do I have any kind of what?
Last last thoughts or anything like that before we go?
Sure. Well, candidly, I don't really understand this Bayesian analysis, and I just suspect that the best history, it's not done like when I was a little kid, there was this other kid who told me, his dad lifted up a building one time, and a really smart person could run some statistics and stuff. I just suspect that the best history is done by just common sense people looking at evidence and saying, no, I don't buy your story, or yeah, that sounds reasonable. Like all of it is so convoluted to me. What if you're getting something wrong in the process?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is like, if you don't model it, then that's much more prone to error, because then it's just bias. You're just stating your bias. You're not actually analyzing why do you think it's highly unlikely. Like if you take the example, let's actually bring the calculator up. If you take the example of my dad lifted a building, now we're going to rule out that he's being silly and he meant with a crane, and that he's actually like described. No, literally like Superman, he lifted a building. Why do we disbelieve that? Like, why do we disbelieve that? And the reason is like we have tons of data through history and our own personal experience that humans just never have that kind of strength. And you could say it's got to be billions to one, right? Like there's 6 billion people now. Not a single one of them has this. And the odds are less than that, like way less than that. But we're going to be super generous to our friend here and say it's 6 million. We'll even do 6 billion. We'll even do that large a number in the calculator. What is the maximum the calculator will do?
I really have no idea. I haven't stress tested like that. But would that would be like a 1 to like 6,000 or something like that, right?
Let's say 6,000. That's a ridiculously high probability. In no way are the odds 1 to 6,000 that he lifted a building. Like it's way less than that. It's 1 to like trillions, right? Simply because we know so much about physics, we know so much about human anatomy, we know so much of it. But there's so much evidence that the supernatural doesn't exist, etc. We have all of that evidence weighing against. So the frequency of people lifting buildings or even having the ability to lift buildings is astronomically low. We know that, and that's all based on evidence. It's based on frequency of data how often do we find this kind of thing? How often do we find the capabilities that would make this kind of thing possible? If the answer is 0 out of billions of opportunities, then your odds against are billions to 1. And so we're going to do 6,000 instead of 6 billion, just so we don't break the calculator. And then that would be the worst odds. And no, actually, yeah, the worst. Okay, let's do 1,000 for the best odds, right? That these are absurd numbers. They're nowhere this likely, but and then we've only got one piece of evidence, so let's eliminate the other evidence. So get rid of anything else there. Oh, there's only one thing. Okay, rename twins. Oh yeah, eliminate that. Just so delete that, right? Or is that the first? Okay.
Well, that's the first one, so I can't delete it, but I can rename it.
Great, perfect. Yeah, let's rename that. My friend told me. And now let's say worst odds on, like, how likely is it that your friend would tell you this and it didn't happen, right? Like, does that make your friend a liar? Is he delusional? Like, what is that? Normally, you would say like the probability of someone telling a lie or being delusional or something like that is certainly, like, we have lots of frequent examples of it, so it's frequent enough. Unlike people lifting buildings, right? So I'd say the probability, if he's lying or whatever, the probability that he would be telling the story the way he is, and the probability that he would be the only evidence, his story would be the only evidence we have. There's no newspapers. You look and you don't find newspapers or any of that stuff. It's very unlikely, right? So the probability, I would say, is, or no, I would say the probability that he would say it if he was delusional, let's just say 100. Just put 100%. We're just going to use 100 as the number. So, and then the probability that he would say it if it was true is also 100. And we'll make that the worst. No, that would be the best, right? So we'll do that as the best. 1-to-1, even odds that he's lying or telling the truth. But really, we think it's more likely, given the evidence, it's like, I would say 100-to-1 against him, right? Like if it really happened, he should have more evidence than his story. Right, so the probability that all the evidence that exists is just his witness to it is low, and so we'll say 1-to-100. Yeah, and so we're being super generous to him. So it's only a 50-50 chance that he's lying to us or delusional. But okay, let's hit the results and see what we get. And you notice the odds that it's true are just so low that the calculator can't even tell us, right? Like, it's between 0 and 1. Like that's literally the bottoming out of the calculator.
Yeah,
and that's because the prior was so low, right? And even if you added evidence that was good, let's go back. Let's do this again. Let's do it the other way around. Let's say, like, I am so confident that my friend would never lie or never be delusional, and I think it's like 10 times more likely he's telling the truth than not. So let's do the best odds, 10-to-1. So we're giving it this evidence a lot of weight. We're saying this is really good evidence. He's a strong witness. I really trust him. And then let's see what happens. Okay. Let's do 100. Let's do 100. 100-to-1 that he's lying, right? And this is funny because this math that I'm doing right now, Christian apologists have done this with Bayes' theorem, and absurdly, not wisely the way I'm doing it now. But so this is a real thing in apologetics. But anyway, yeah. So 10%, right? So like if it's 100-to-1 against your friend being wrong, you're so confident that he can't possibly be wrong, that you're saying 100-to-1, 100 times more likely that he's telling the truth, and he really saw this and it really happened, than that it didn't. Even with that confidence, the frequency of that kind of phenomenon happening is so low that even that evidence only gets you to a 10% chance that his dad actually lifted a building. And remember, we were being absurd with the 6,000. It's like 6 billion, 100 billion, trillions, right? So it's not even 10%. But the point being is that this is showing you how evidence increases probabilities, and how evidence needs to be really strong, the less likely the hypothesis, right? It needs to be stronger. They need to counteract each other. And there's a lot of like intuitions that we have about evidence, like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, that's Bayesian. That's literally saying it, like if it's 6,000-to-1 against, then you need evidence that's 6,000 times more likely if it's true. And so it tells you, like, what do you actually need? What kind of evidence, and why do you need that kind of evidence to flip the odds, to make something impossible probable again, right? And then also, like, it's forcing you to ask these questions, like, well, how confident are you in your friend not being a liar or crazy or whatever, or joking, right? Like, you might realize that your confidence in that is not very high, whereas your confidence that the world doesn't work that way is high. And then you'll ask yourself, why? Why is my confidence that the world works that way really high, but my confidence in my friend never telling a lie or never being wrong about something, why is it low? And the answer is all your experience with human beings, all your experience and knowledge of the world, physics and the world and all of that stuff. You know, people frequently can be delusional, frequently can be joking, frequently can be lying. You do not know that about people lifting buildings or having even the ability to lift buildings. And so all of this stuff, you're already doing it in your head. You're doing the math in your head. You're just not seeing numbers when you do it. And all Bayes' theorem allows you to do is to actually see what's going on in your head. Why are you coming to the conclusions that you are? What's really going on? And so it shows you the structure of your own reasoning. And the calculator can be a tool that you can dink around with to see, like how do we get different probabilities out of this? What has to be the case? How much more likely must this evidence be on one theory than another? And then you can use the calculator to start see these things, and then you start to understand them. And once you start to understand them, then you can actually think this way and catch a lot of stuff. And I'll give you an example. My article, Bayesian counter apologetics, is an example. Like, once I had this, I was anti-Bayesian, and then someone convinced me, like I was arguing against it until I realized I was totally wrong. And then it was a eureka moment. I said, oh my God, this is a universal acid. You could use this to test all kinds of things. And that led to that one of many things it led to was that article. But that article shows that when you put the evidence back in that Christian apologists leave out, every argument for God becomes an argument against God. And that's because what they do is they focus on the evidence that they want to claim is improbable unless a God did it. But they're ignoring all the evidence that is actually improbable if a God did it. And when you put that evidence back in, the odds all flip the other way. And once you understand that, you just need to understand the logic of Bayes' theorem. You don't even need to use real actual numbers. You don't need the calculator to do it. It's just the calculator can help you to start seeing these patterns when you dink around with it. And so that's one of the uses of it.
Yeah, I just want to. I just
I
wanted
always
to.
suspect that mythicists are making a category error because obviously, like, probably most of them are atheists, and it's like when they fight God, it's like he didn't exist, and so they're fighting God on that front, on the he didn't exist front. And then when they get to Jesus, fighting Jesus, I think they're still in that same mode. Like, the best way to fight him is to Christ at the Christian.
No.
You may be surprised to know that I have vehemently argued against that position. I have an article called "Finca is Right." You should not be using the non-existence of Jesus as an argument against Christianity. It's a bad argument. No, absolutely not. But I'm aware that you're talking about, there are Christians who, they're usually ex-fundamentalists, right? There are some Christians who were so burned by the church, like serious bad shit, and then other people, like, even if that didn't happen, they realize they've been lied to their whole lives, and they get angry about being lied to. And so, well, if they lied about that, they must have lied about everything. And so they jump all the way to the other conclusion. Well, maybe Jesus didn't even exist, right? So it's not a reasoned position. It is a sort of motivated position. I do think those people exist. I wasn't one of them. I was a historicist and an adamant historicist, and I attacked mythicists until I did the study. I did like a reasonable objective study, and I had to admit that there is a truth to this. There's a lot of bad mythicism that is totally bonkers, and I've written against that too. But once you find there is one theory that holds up better than all the others, and I was surprised to find that it actually does hold up better than any model of historicity that I've seen so far. So your description doesn't apply to me. Like I actually was totally fine with a mundane account of a historical Jesus. There's entirely plausible historical Jesuses that don't threaten atheism in any way. So anyway, that doesn't describe me or my study, or Lataster and his study, which are the two, the peer-reviewed studies on this, which are not amateur internet mythicism, but like serious academic mythicism.
Yeah, and if I can add, caller, that I think that like your point about how difficult the question of Jesus's historicity is versus like your friend lifting a car off of somebody, like that. I feel like that's just a level of like they're just different levels of difficulty. So like when we're talking about establishing somebody as a historical person, that's a much harder question than something that can like pass the smell test or something. Like
Right.
yeah. I feel like you can easily do that kind of, I guess, quick math in your head about whether or not your friend's lying about this, whether his dad actually lifted a car off of whatever, whoever in the world. So I feel like that's like an easy, like that's an example that you would use, like if you were taking like a Bayesian reasoning.
Well, I'm sure
sort of
there
class.
are very intelligent people who could use some kind of statistical analysis to prove that he must have done it. And I wouldn't know where he got it wrong. That was the
Ooh,
point I was
yeah,
making.
that's why you need to learn it. That's why it's so important. Precisely because
All right,
you can trip
that's fair.
yourself up. You can trip yourself up. People can trip you up by using the reasoning. They don't even have to use numbers. They don't even have to mention the word Bayes. They can use the argument to try and trip you up. But if you know Bayes' theorem, you can model their argument. You can model your own thought process, and you can compare them, and you can test, basically burn test all the premises, because then you can figure out what the premises even are, the sort of hidden premises in your line of thinking. And it comes down to prior odds. How are you calculating it?
To prove that Jesus was resurrected.
What about the resurrection? Say again. What was it? I didn't hear the question about the resurrection.
Somebody that's used Bayes' reasoning in order to, or a Bayesian analysis to prove that Jesus
and prove
resurrected.
God existed too. Yeah, we talked about this at the beginning of the stream. It's easy to do bogus Bayesian stuff. There's tons of bogus stuff. Bad inputs equals bad outputs.
So you can detect where they went wrong.
Yeah, you can use Bayes' theorem to find what's gone wrong, and that's actually super helpful. And I actually have several articles. I have one on William Lane Craig. I have one on William Lane Craig, and then I have one on Unwin and Swinburne. Actually, Swinburne and Unwin. They both use Bayesian arguments, and I explain why their arguments are bogus. And you can figure that out more easily when you understand Bayes' theorem, because then you can see how they're misusing it. Right. You can see the trick they're pulling once you know what the actual mechanism of thought is that it's describing. And if you read those articles, you'll see what I'm talking about, like how you can zero in on honest and sound uses of Bayes' theorem and just bogus apologetic uses that are. It's like lying with statistics, right? You can do that, but that doesn't mean all statistics are bogus. There's a difference between doing it honestly and doing it not.
Yeah, I would say a crude analogy to like using Bayesian analysis for like God existing or Jesus resurrecting would be like, well, I want to open up my car door. What's the best way to do that? And the apologists are saying, take a hammer and break the window, and then you can open it from the inside. Like, that's not how you would use a hammer, and that's also not how you would open the car door. And I feel like the same can be said, for using Bayesian reasoning in order to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Like any tool that you have in your tool bag or whatever can be misused in order to do something wrong or prove something wrong, but that doesn't mean that they're using that tool correctly.
Yeah, and I've done it correctly to show why Bayesian reasoning proves that the resurrection is not believable. And I've done that I did it informally in The Christian Delusion, edited by John Loftus. And I did it formally in The End of Christianity, also edited by John Loftus, where in footnotes, I actually put the equations in. In the original article, I just stealth Bayes everyone. I just use a Bayesian argument and never mention Bayes or the math or anything. But in the second in the chapter in the other book, The End of Christianity, I actually put the math in the footnotes. So you can use Bayesian theory soundly to do this, but yeah, you can also use it to trick people. And if you want to tell the difference, you do have to understand it so you can spot what people are doing and what they're doing wrong.
Yeah. All right. It was great talking to you. We have been on the call for quite a while now, so I need to let you go because we do have a couple other callers to get to. Somebody that's been waiting a very long time. I really appreciate you calling in, and I hope to talk to you in the future.
Do we have more calls, or what's our sitch?
Oh yes, we definitely have more calls. So I do want to get to another super chat. We got a member chat, Limited Light, who says, "Let's get mathematical. Let me hear the numbers
talk. Yeah.
Numbers talk." We do have Jesus Tales asked a Bayesian a couple Bayesian questions, which I want to get to kind of at the end, but you know, we do have these last couple of callers that have been waiting a while, so I do want to get to them before we get to the rest of the super chats. All right, hi there, caller. How you doing? What's your name?
Well, my name is Granton Chatham Cold Iron.
Oh, Cold Iron. How you doing?
Yep, doing well.
Good. So did you have a question that you wanted to ask Richard Curry about Bayesian analysis?
Yes, I did have a question, but to add on to previous Bayes analysis of lifting a building, I have actually lifted a building before. It was a small building, not attached to a foundation, and only a little bit.
Right. Yeah, that's why I bracketed the crane. Like I did it with the crane. Like, oh, okay, come on. Yeah.
No, not with crane. Bare hand.
I know, but that's an example of it's like saying, yeah, I've lifted a building. I mean, technically, I have too.
So how does it factor in, though, of claims that are made, but the truth is just slightly off from that?
Yeah, so there's the question of when people are analyzing a fact claim, have they misapprehended what the claim is? So like if I say I lifted a building, aka a dollhouse, I could say, yeah, I can lift buildings. Most people, unless I'm clarifying, most people are going to take me to mean like houses, right? Like large buildings that weigh many tons. And so that's a different problem of trying to get at what did a person mean? Were they trying to trick you in the way they were wording their thing? So when I took the question, my dad lifted a house or lifted a building, I was taking it as spoken and not like this. I bracketed away and said like, well, we're going to rule out all the trickster versions of this, where he meant dollhouse or he used a crane or that kind of stuff. But if you want to get into the nitty gritty of like in history where someone says something. What do they actually mean? Maybe they don't mean what everybody thinks they meant, right? Like then you're getting into another level of Bayesian reasoning where you're analyzing what is the prior probability that this sentence at that time in that language would mean this or in that context and things like that. And that actually touches on the thing I did just last week, which was preterism. So I did a whole article on preterism, which is all about this, like trying to get people who said something to have meant something else, and is that even probable? And so you can do Bayesian reasoning on that as well, just to get at what do they mean, and then you can test the claim. Like once you figured out what they meant to assert, like what is their proposition, what are they claiming about the world, then you can run another Bayesian analysis on whether that's true. But those are two different things, right? The question of what do they mean when they speak, and is what they said true? Like so two different tasks. They're both empirical tasks, though. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, so like when I lifted my shed to put a shim under it in order to get it more level.
Yeah, right.
Sure, I lifted the building, but
yeah.
And I would think that would factor into like a piece of your evidence too. Like, one piece of evidence would be like, well, how much did the building weigh? And, of course, this is getting past the entire, prior probability of it's like, oh, it was a small building or it was like a portable building or something like that. And so like, I mean, you could pile on the evidence, and as long as you had strong enough evidence to overcome whatever prior probability, I mean, I think that as long as you accurately gauge them, then you'll come out.
I do this with helicopter. Jesus flying into space, flies into the clouds in Acts 1, right? And I do this analysis. Like, well, did he do it with a helicopter or a hot air balloon, which would be a technology we don't think they had, but is at least conceivable that they could have had. And so that's the kind of like, is that even a reasonable way to respond to that? It's like, oh, he flew. What is more likely, that he had a hot air balloon and flew off and they just forgot to report all of the details of it being a hot air balloon. Or they just made it up, right? And so you could do a Bayesian analysis on that, where you're not even dealing with the supernatural, you're not even dealing with impossible things. And that's the same kind of thing you can get with witness testimony, like, oh, he lifted a building. If the context is ambiguous, it might just remain ambiguous, or you say, I don't know if that's true or not, because I'm not sure what he means by a building or lift, right? And so you usually need more context to establish what a person means. And so that's, I think, anyway, that's how I would deal with it as a historian.
The question that I called in with originally was about deciding your prior facts, like where you're starting from, like your initial class and all that kind of stuff. Where you go to like decide your initial starting point, even. How do you best choose that?
So it depends on which starting point we're talking about, but as a historian dealing with anything to do with the origins of Christianity, for example, the starting point is to get familiar with the background, right, of what's usual, what's typical. Even like when you're trying to figure out what a sentence means, like what does it normally mean in that language at that time from that particular type of person and so on. So you need all that background knowledge to actually understand what your starting assumptions are. And I think then there's also everything we know about physics and human biology and all of that too. And you have, oftentimes you get Christian apologists will say, well, you just have an anti-supernatural bias, right? Like you're starting from the position of naturalism. We're starting from the position of supernaturalism. And that's why you're getting different results than us. And the response that I make to that is that the supernaturalist position is unempirical, whereas the naturalist position is empirical. So when I start from a presumption of naturalism, I'm building on a massive database of evidence that establishes naturalism as the most likely starting position. And so if you're going to argue against that starting position, you've got a huge burden of evidence to meet before you can flip that position. You can change that premise, right? And Christians never meet that burden. They never can establish that supernaturalism is even true, much less in any particular case that favors them. But it always goes back to evidence. It always goes back to facts, data, things that you can empirically access. So what is the evidence of the world? What is the evidence of history? What has science found, et cetera? How do people speak? How does language get used? Like all of this stuff it all comes back. So when you try to question someone's premises, it gets to that. That's where the argument would be like, well, what is that premise based on? What is your evidence? Is that evidence good? Is it strong enough to establish the premise? And that's a completely reasonable way to go. Like you can go and critique that way and discover that, oh, their premises are sound after all. But it's good to have at least questioned them, to ask the question of why do you believe that premise is true, and so true, so probable that we don't have to even question it in the analysis. Like, why are we taking it as a premise? That's good critical thinking, is to figure out and to get to the answer too. Like, oh, there's a good reason to take that as the premise and not doubt it, and then work that out, right? So that's an entirely valid analysis, and I think most philosophy does that, right? That's how you get to a particular position, if you're doing this well, soundly, or not.
Is there a benefit for starting with as little in your initial premise as possible and building up from there, or just starting with we can just say all of this in one fell swoop?
Yeah.
Like for your mimesis argument of these God men on this kind of descriptor, we just put in 20 or how many ever different examples, versus we are talking about a person, 50% chance of person, and they look like this person who didn't exist, change the odds. They look like this person who did exist, change the odds, and just add people one by one. Like, how would that difference?
So I'm not sure what you're describing. It sounds like the method of iteration, where you start with no knowledge and keep adding data and update. Yeah, I talk about this in both my books, Proving History and On the Historicity of Jesus. The math works out the same, right? So you can do it the long, arduous way, or you can skip to the end. The disadvantage of skipping to the end, and I think it's what you're hitting on, is that there can be a mistake somewhere in there, and you leapt too far, and you're not on a secure spot. And so it is legitimate for critical thinking to test those assumptions. Like, let's run that back. Like, is that where we get if we actually iterate item by item? Do we get to that same place? And I actually work this out. I give an example of it in chapter 6 of On the Historicity of Jesus, where I say, well, if we start with these assumptions and then start adding data, do we get to the same place than if we just jump to the end and say, well, this is how many we counted, this is how many are historical, this is how many aren't, and so on. Yeah, it's a legitimate process to question that, because it's valuable to have gone through it. Even if you end up agreeing with the premise in the end, you will understand why. And I think that's valuable and always worth doing.
Yeah.
I guess I took it more of like a category type of thing. Like you wouldn't be like adding individual people as evidence that Jesus existed. You would be identifying a pattern of person.
Yeah, it's the same thing though, right? So like you say, like, well, what if there's 2 of these guys? What if there's 3? Oh, now we find a 4th one. Oh, now we find a 5th one. Like, if it actually happened chronologically, like if we suddenly discovered a cache of documents that had introduced a whole bunch more of these guys, we would have to add that in, right, and redo the math. And you can do it, just start over, or you can do it iteratively by adding them one by one. The math always ends up being the same, and in fact, you can actually use that as a way to test the math to make sure that you're not screwing up, because it should come out the same whether you're adding successively or throwing them all together and just looking at the big picture as is.
All right. Thank you so much there, Cold Iron. We do have a couple of other people to get to. Did you have any final thoughts or ideas that you wanted to pass along?
Well, my entry into this is growing up. I just metaphors, so I never actually really had a firm grounding of this always had to have existed. So I'm coming at it from a very different angle from most other people, it seems. It's like, yeah, well, just metaphors, and it's the same category of story from the Bible as The Little Engine That Could or Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. They're just stories that are trying to convey a message of how to live life.
Yeah, and I think so. There's a lot to that in the way the mythology throughout history has been developed. But at the same time, there's this trend to believe the myth literally. And it's a psychological process. So some people it doesn't take. So some people are fine with the metaphor and they don't get trapped in thinking that it has to be true. So you can use, for instance, Star Wars as, we could draw a bunch of teachings and lessons from stories in Star Wars and use, but you don't have to believe they're true to get the truth out of them, right? The truth about human nature and decisions and things like that. But then there are some people who just need to believe it's true. They're uncomfortable with the idea that you're using fiction to teach lessons about reality. And so for them, it becomes important that it's true. And then, of course, when you build a hierarchy over this, where your entire job is based on, and your position of authority as a priest, for example, is based on it being true, because you built it that way, then there you get opposition to this idea that it's all metaphor. And that's where you get the war between the liberal Christians and the fundamentalist Christians over the control of the text. Like the fundamentalists want to read the text literally, the liberals want to read it mythically, allegorically, like it's not literally true, but there's still lessons there, right? That's horrifying to the fundamentalists, which is why they're fundamentalists, right? And so this trend always exists. And there's Kurt Knoll did a good study of this, analyzing how there's a evolutionary sort of Darwinian tendency for churches to evolve into literalist churches. Like the liberal churches tend to dissolve over time, literalist churches tend to grow, and there's a psychological reason why that is. And so I think that's relevant to the history of religion and why people are so invested in having to believe these things are true. And I talk about this somewhat on the Historicity of Jesus. It comes up a few times. I use the King Arthur example early on, but I bring it up many other times throughout the text.
All right, Cold Iron, thank you so much for calling in, and I hope that you'll call in the future.
All right, who do we got next?
Yep.
Yeah. They've been good
All
questions
right.
so far from everybody. I have to say, it's just not the show I thought I was coming on to do, but happy to be here. So
Yeah, no, I totally didn't expect this many people to call in as well. Here's another super chat from John Komatsu, who says, "Thanks, Dr. Carrier, for all your work, and especially for Sense and Goodness Without God. Recently read it and feel all good." Feel all could gain from the book. Even theists, the book filled me with joy and for just being human. Mahalos.
yeah, thank you. That's really kind. I believe that too. I just don't know if I'm gaslighting myself. So it's always nice to see someone notice that as well and think that. So I'm glad of that. Thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, like I said, I still have I'm keeping in reserve 2 of Jesus Tales super chats because they do concern Bayesian reasoning, but people have been calling in. This next caller's been waiting for a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and get to them. Yeah. All right. Hello, caller. What's your name?
My name's Kenneth.
Hey,
I
Kenneth.
have 2 questions.
Okay.
One is, so what is the probability that the Romans would deify a Jew after they just destroyed them in war? And 2, what is the probability that Paul existed or did not exist?
Okay. Yeah. I have an article on Paul, the historicity of Paul, why we trust it. For one thing, we have the writings, and there's not so the way you would put it, like a normal historical argument, you would say it's not plausible. The authentic letters of Paul are not plausible coming from as forgeries that didn't come from the actual guy. In Bayesian terms, we would say it's very improbable that the epistles we have would look the way they do and have the arguments that they have, as opposed to other arguments. And therefore, because the epistles, the authentic epistles, would look very differently if they were forged than if they are written by the guy who says he wrote them and when he says he wrote them, roughly. That probability translates to the historicity of Paul. So the evidence of that is so unlikely, unless Paul existed, that we should conclude that he did. Now, we don't have that for Jesus. We don't have writings from Jesus at all, much less writings that that actually are that improbable otherwise. They're that convincing and don't look fake. We have fake stuff from Jesus. There's the letter to King Abgar in Eusebius. So we have a lot of fake stuff. And it looks exactly like what you would expect if it was fake. Like, so that's fake. Like, the probability of that being a letter that a real Jesus would write is very low. It's the other way around, right? And so that's how we do this, right? We use the evidence we have, and we ask, how probable is that evidence? Now let's do this. Let's do Paul real quick. I know I can't answer everything you asked, but let's do Paul in here. Prior odds. So Paul is not a tragic hero king. He's not a celestial superhero. He's not heavily mythologized. He's mythologized, but not as heavily as Jesus. He's actually just a mundane guy. He's basically just a preacher running around. He doesn't even really claim any supernatural mega powers. He claims miraculous powers, but they're not. They're the kinds of things that any faith healing act could pull off. So he could be fully convinced that that he's got these powers and stuff. So there's, if you think of like, how often do these mundane letter writers writing this kind of stuff, how often do they exist? They usually exist. Like, there's not a lot of fake ones. Unlike, superheroes, like mythic superheroes, there's a ton of them don't exist. So it's the opposite. So Paul starts out in a different reference class. He starts out in a class of people who usually existed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the worst odds on Paul existing at 3-1. So actually, let's make it 2-1. Let's do it that way. 2-1. So it's just the opposite of Jesus, right? And then best odds, I would put better. I would do like 5-1, let's say. And if people are asking, like, where am I picking these numbers? I'm thinking, I'm trying in my head, I'm thinking of like how many mundane letter writers from antiquity don't exist. And then there's not a lot in my head, and I'm an ancient historian, right? Like, actual PhD in this, so I can't think of a lot of them. They exist, but there's not a lot. How many did exist? Like, tons, right? Like, there's a lot. So I know it's way more than 5-1, like more than 5 times. So when we do 5-1, we're saying 5 times more of these guys existed than didn't exist. And I think it's like 10, maybe 100 times, but I'm going to be super conservative and say it's 5 to 1, 2 to 1 at lowest. But in both of those numbers, I'm saying prior odds Paul existed, but evidence could change this. So let's go in. Let's see what the evidence does. I won't go into all of the evidence. Let's rename this evidence, and let's call it pastiche theory.
Sorry, you're gonna need to spell that for me.
Yeah, I gotcha. Pastiche, and I'm not gonna get into more detail. We could add more evidence than this and so on, and we could keep adding evidence, naming them, giving them odds and stuff. I'm just gonna do the one just to show you how the reasoning works. Now, pastiche theory. The letters of the authentic letters of Paul, there's 7, maybe only 6 authentic letters of Paul. The others are forgeries. Of the authentic letters, they are pastiches of other letters. So meaning someone cut and pasted pieces of other letters and mashed them together into the letters that we have. So 1 Corinthians is actually multiple letters that's been mashed together. Pieces are missing and they've been stuck together in places that don't even make sense. There's multiple introductions or conclusions. Like you can see, there's been a lot of studies of this. So most of the letters that are authentic are mixes together of multiple letters. They're not one long letter that he wrote. And so the question is, like, if they were forged, why would a forger do that? It doesn't make any sense, right? It's not impossible. It's possible someone forged the letters and then someone else came along and edited them and pastiched them, right? But now we're getting epicycles with an epicycle. So we're still, like I said, what is the probability that the evidence would look like this? That would be the pastiche elements. What is the probability that that would be there if Paul did exist? And it's 100%. Well, there's no reason why his existing would prevent this from happening. So let's put that. Let's put both of them at 100. Just type in 100, and that way we can see the odds.
Like 100 to 1.
Well, we'll change the bottom ones in a moment. So let's just set the top ones at 100. Because when you're doing these odds, you're doing the likelihood ratio of the probability of the evidence on one theory and then the probability of the evidence on that theory being false. So now we're going to estimate the probability of that same evidence if Paul didn't exist. And I'd say it's no better than 10%. So let's put that in the best odds. No, in the worst odds, 10%. No, best odds would be 10%. Go down, sorry. Best odds, 10%. Worst odds, 1%.
Okay, so would that be on the denominator? Is that 1? Is that 10?
Denominator would be 10 on the best side, yeah. So, okay. And the reason I asked you to put the percentages is because that still gives you the ratio, right? So, and this is evidence, so they don't have to add up to 1. This is another thing that Kovacs got wrong. But anyway, so 100% to 1% is the worst. Like that's the worst this evidence looks. 100% to 10% is the best odds I can give on this if Paul didn't exist, right? So that's my range, my margin of error. Why do I pick those values? It's, again, I'm thinking in my head of how likely is it, and all the evidence I understand the frequency of human behavior. I think it's very unlikely that a forgery explanation would make the evidence look like this. But I'm going to be super generous against myself. And so the 10% is I'm trying to think of how probable could I make it and still believe that would be a credible probability. And I say it's 10, like 1 out of 10 times, maybe. Like that, I'm pushing it. Like that's already, it seems like being too generous to the forgery theory. And so that's how I get my range. The bottom of my margin of error, the worst, and the top of my margin of error, the best. And now let's see what happens. Okay, so it broke the calculator. So the odds that Paul existed is basically better than 99, no matter what you do. And that's because, yeah, I'm weighing it so high. I'm weighing that evidence high. Now, say that someone else comes along. Oh, yeah, what did you do just there?
Oh, I did 10 to 1 as opposed to 100 and 100. Like worst.
I see. Yeah, okay, yeah, very good. Those are both 10 to 1 though. So.
What is the evidence, and how do you calculate that, the evidence?
Yeah, so how did I do that just now, right? So what we do intuitive when we don't use the math, like if we don't even know the math, a historian would just say, it just seems improbable to me that a forgery would be pastiched, that the letters would have this pastiche quality. that looks something that's entirely expected if he does exist, because then that's what they would do. He would write these authentic letters. Someone wouldn't like them, and so they would, or wants to summarize them, so they would edit them and put them together. Whereas a forger would just completely create a wholesale letter, like 2 Thessalonians, for example, which is a forgery purported to be by Paul, but it is not pastiched. It's a completely coherent fake letter. And that's exactly what we expect from a forger, whereas the other letters don't look like that. So the question is, you're saying, well, you would just say, I think it's improbable that they would look like this if they were forged. Therefore, I'm going to conclude that they're not forged. And that's how a historian would normally just say it. But there's a sort of huge missing gap there. It's like, is that the conclusion you should reach? Like, how improbable do you mean? And is it improbable enough to be confident in your conclusion, right? And so that's why you start to put numbers to these things. And someone could come along, like especially an expert in Paul or ancient letters or whatever, could come along and argue with me about these numbers. I think your numbers are wrong. And then we go, okay, like give me some evidential reasons to change the numbers. Like, how frequent do you think this would actually be? And then we would have that exchange. They might change my mind by presenting evidence that would relate to how frequently forgeries do this versus how frequently authentic letters would end up this way. And then we would change our numbers. I would change the numbers because they would have convinced me. And that's how this works. And the thing is, like, we could have totally had that whole argument and never use numbers, right? It's when you're using the numbers, you have some sort of benchmark you're looking at. Now you know what you're actually asking. It's like, why do I think 100 to 1, right? And I'm thinking, like, because it's extremely rare for a forger to do this, for any forgery to end up looking like this. And extremely rare, like 100 to 1, is I think 100 times more likely, or 100 times more often, this is going to be a sign of authentic letters than forgeries, right? I could be wrong about that, but that's why it's my worst estimate. And so I try to argue against myself as much as possible. That's when I pick the best estimate. And if someone wants to argue me out of that position, they're probably going to attack the best estimate to try and get that up. But they might want the worst one to come up too, right? So that's but really all arguments we're having are arguments about these three numbers: the prior probabilities that we entered earlier, which is how often do letter writers tend to exist, and then how often do pastiche letters how often are that the result of forgery rather than authenticity? And that's what we're arguing about all the time. And so putting numbers to it allows us to see that we're really only arguing over three numbers. And we have a margin of error, like how uncertain are we of our numbers, and that's measured by our margin of error. And so we can do all of this and then see the logic.
Like arguing just for the author.
Sorry, can you restate that?
But not. Yeah. So is that? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I didn't hear quite what your question was.
Okay. So is that just the probability for the author of Paul, but not the actual character of Paul?
Well, that gets into the question of what would be the difference, right? The reason I framed it as authentic being historical and forgery being not is that if they're authentic, they're definitely written before the 60s AD, and so that would be Paul, right? Like, so like if you say, well, no, his name was Simon. Oh. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't matter what his name really was. It's still the guy, and he still wrote it, and the circumstances he's describing really happened. So
I would have an issue with like Romans being pre-70. So I would see Romans as being right after construction.
Yeah, I would disagree with you,
because of like chapter 11.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that you would do. Like, okay, let's look at chapter 11. And you would say, I think this content is improbable if it was written before 70. But then you have to explain, like, how improbable and why do you think it's that improbable and not something else? And that would be where the discussion would go. That would be our argument. And then ideally, if like we're both reasonable people, we would settle on the probability of that, and it would go into the model. We would put the numbers in, and we would see what the effect of our conclusion is about that. Even if it's improbable on Paul not existing or Paul existing, it's still possible that it's not strong enough evidence to confirm that, right? So, and then you can have the other effect where you can say, well, what if we just say that Romans is a forgery and the other letters are authentic, right? So you could say that there's an authentic Paul who wrote 1 Corinthians, but Romans is a forgery, right? Like that could be the alternative hypothesis that comes out of this. And so, yeah, that's when things start to get complicated in terms of multiple hypotheses that you're exploring.
Right. And so like Second Corinthians, for example, like Second Corinthians 11, when he's, talking about King Aretas and Damascus.
Right.
There's really no evidence that suggests that, at that time, that Jesus had control over Damascus. So,
yeah, so that's the argument, right? People have made that. Real scholars have made that argument. That's not out there. And I have a whole article on this. So I think it's the one on the dating of Paul. Let me quickly find that because it's different from my Historicity of Paul. I mentioned this in the Historicity of Paul article, but I have a whole article on the Aratus question, which is.
Yeah, I believe that's how do we know the Apostle Paul wrote in his epistles in 50s? Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I had to reference that today.
Yeah, okay, yeah. How do we know the Apostle Paul wrote his epistles in the 50s AD? What I show is that the assumption that what he's describing is questionable. The other argument, the other scholars have made these arguments. Another argument is that there actually is a window where Aratus may have had control of Damascus. We actually can't rule that out as decisively as we would like, and that affects the odds, right? So, like if we had really good data for Damascus, so that we knew for sure Aratus never controlled Damascus, that would be a stronger argument than when we have the case where there was the Damascus rebellion or the Aratus rebellion. And there's the actually entirely possible that he briefly held Damascus precisely in 36 AD, which is weirdly exactly when these letters chronologize it. So that coincidence is hard to explain unless it actually happened. Now, I don't think Aratus had anything to do with Damascus. I think what Paul is describing is his marshals going after him after Paul got up to something in Arabia. I don't think it's saying that Aratus controls Damascus. I think it's saying that Aratus sent his marshals after Paul in Damascus. And so anyway, but to get to that, like that gets into the language and what do the words mean and what are the contexts and so on. And that can change your estimate. Or once you put all that background knowledge, since all these odds, all these probabilities are conditional on background knowledge, they change when your background knowledge changes. So when you learn new things about the text and what the language means and stuff, it can change your perspective on that. And anyway, if you want to deep dive that my article on that goes into that in detail. You'll find, ironically, that it shows that the same evidence could establish Paul in the 50s BC, where Aratus did control Damascus, and that would actually track to the other tradition that placed Jesus being killed around 75 BC by the Jews, and we mentioned that at the top of the live stream. So one can make an argument that Paul should be placed in the 50s BC. And so you do have to ask, like, why don't we do that? And so I talk about that a little bit in that article as well. And there, I think, like, there's a stronger case the stronger case than scholars will admit. I'm not convinced by it. I don't think Paul wrote in the 50s BC, but I would not be shocked if we got some new evidence that proved that he did, because the evidence does line up, I have to say. It's just not strong enough to overwhelm all the other evidence.
And so what about like the silence of the knowledge of Paul until the late 2nd century? How does that fit into any of it?
So I assume you're therefore dating Acts to the late 2nd century. That would be definitely unorthodox. Yeah. The new mainstream
contradicts Paul, like in the timing of his conversion.
In fact, it contradicts Paul so clearly that it indicates the author of Acts knows the letters of Paul, which actually tracks all the data we have about the author of Luke and Acts, because Mark is definitely built out of the letters of Paul. Luke is relying on Mark. So anyway, this gets into like multiple. We could go forever on all of this, but it won't help this particular talk. But I have articles on these things and cover some of it in my book. Definitely worth chewing over. Like these are all like sound questions to ask. And there have been there's a new breed of scholars who are deeply, deeply skeptical now of Paul, or our version of Paul anyway.
So yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'll check it out. It's on your website. I can find all this on your website.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Carrier has an extensive set of blogs that you can definitely search on his website, like for the specific information. Like
yeah, you can put the name Aratos, spell it correctly, but you put in Aratos and it will get you to all the articles I've written that touch on that. For example, and that's at richardcarrier.info. So
All
it's my name.info.
Okay, cool. I sure do appreciate it. Thank y'all for y'all's time.
Yeah, no,
thanks.
thank you so much for calling in. Really appreciate it. All right, we do have one other caller before we get into, I guess, the more free form, Q&A that I promised everybody through the super chats.
Cool.
I do want to bring up hold on, let me move our faces around. Limited Light says 2 companies manufacture a rocket. We know what percentage of the 2 make and what percentage from each company blow up. Then you can calculate the posteriori if one blew up.
A posteriori.
Oh, a posteriori.
Right. Which company made it? Yeah, I mean, that's a highly artificial example, really, because we almost never are in the dark as to whose rocket blew up, so you don't really need to do this math. So yeah, but that's the kind of model that they'll use in classes and stuff to do simple Bayesian reasoning on determining things like that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Limited Light. Limited Light's an actual mathematical or math teacher professor, so he loves all the math stuff. But we do have one more caller before we address the rest of the super chats, and then maybe we can take some Q&A. I'll open the lines back up, about halfway through this call that we're about to take. But I'll let y'all know when I do that. But we're going to take this last call here on Bayesian reasoning. Hi, caller. What's your name?
Dalton, the Bible guy.
Hey, Dalton. How you doing?
Hey, Carlos. How you doing? This question isn't strictly about Bayesian theory, but I've been really wanting to talk to Dr. Carrier about this specific question I've been mulling over for the past few weeks. Dr. Carrier, first and foremost, let's let you know that on my TikTok channel, we're huge fans of you and your literature. And it's really good to see good mythicism scholarship, because there's a lot of bad stuff out there.
Yeah.
And we are really looking forward to regardless to getting around to having you debate a certain individual on TikTok who's a bad proponent for the theory. But my question is, in your opinion, based on your reading of 1 Corinthians 15, what exactly do you think is Paul's theology on the resurrection of the dead? Like, does he understand Jesus' resurrection to be like the body coming back to life itself, or is it like because the way I understand, the way I'm reading it, Paul seems to make the analogy of the seed sprouting, and from the seed sprouts forth like the plant. Like, does Paul see Jesus' like spirit as coming forth from the husk of his body? I just want to know what your opinion on this, and whether or not it was possible for
that.
I think in the first century,
I think you're right.
Actually, take a purely
yeah, for sure. That's my view. Now, this is debated. I'll point out, like, scholars debate this, including mainstream scholars, not just Christian apologists, because Christian apologists have an agenda, right? But even secular scholars debate, what did Paul mean? And my take is, I take him at his word, which is that we leave, so that Jesus, the way he describes it, the body of flesh is like a bodysuit that's like a crappy one, and you ditch it, and then you jump into like a super suit, a way better suit. It's a supernatural suit, and that suit's like indestructible and immune to disease and immortal and all that stuff. And that's, you rise from the dead in the super suit, and you leave the corpse behind. That's as important, because that means that Paul did not have to believe in an empty tomb, because there could be a body in the tomb. He said, yeah, that's just the shell that he left behind. He rose in a superior, greater body. And it seems like he's answering some sort of argument related to that. It's like, what's the point of being resurrected in this crappy body? It's a crappy body. And in the thing that, if you're interested in this subject, I have a detailed, like really long footnote heavy chapter on the resurrection body in the book called The Empty Tomb. And there are many books called The Empty Tomb, but this is the one that was edited by Jeff Lauder and Robert Price. It goes all the way back to 2005, but it still holds up, the chapter. And the chapter holds up whether Jesus existed or not, because the same model fits both. But yeah, that's my view, is that Paul is preaching a double body resurrection, a two-body resurrection. You leave the old body behind and jump into a new one. And I marshal all the evidence. I look into like the rabbinical evidence, and the Christians themselves debated this, and early Christians debated it. So I bring up their evidence and stuff, and all the texts in Paul, not just 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about it many other places. And so there's a lot of evidence pertaining to this. And I do think that's the theory. This does not mean, however, and is often mistaken as saying that the resurrection was not physical, that it was only spiritual. Paul is specifically saying that a spiritual resurrection is physical. It's a spiritual body, like an actual body. It's physical. And
Right.
for Paul, and it's very similar to most of the rabbis in the Talmudic tradition, it was not conceivable to exist without a body. So this is unlike Plato and Platonists, who thought you could have a disembodied soul. It's like you get in Homer, like the shades, these sort of disembodied souls that just have an appearance and you can't touch them. The rabbinical tradition doesn't buy that. Like you can't exist or be conscious without a body. You have to have a body to interact with the world in any way. And we get this in Origen, the Christian scholar of the 3rd century. And I very much think Paul is in that tradition. He thinks that like when you're dead, you're just unconscious. You're just an idea in the mind of God until he stamps you back in a new body. And he can stamp you into a new flesh body, which is a crappy body that'll be subject to disease and get old and die. Or he can stamp you into the spiritual body, the pneumatic body, which is made out of pneuma, which is the superior supernatural substance. That's my view. So, and it sounds similar to what you were thinking, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, and in your opinion, so you have the mysticist theory, but you also propose in your book like an alternative, like minimal historicity perspective. So, in your opinion, like the early Christians, even if Jesus did exist as a person and was like executed by the Romans, the idea that his body would have been in a grave or in the tomb even after he would have like appeared to his people, that would not have been a problem for the early Christians.
Correct. Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, but I don't think they would care about the body. That would not affect them. And that's really a modern fundamentalist idea, that the body, it had to rise in the same body. There were Christians back then who were really intent on this. So it's not just a modern idea, but they were so intent on it that it looks like there's an apologetic agenda. There's some good books. Caroline Bynum is a historian who did History of Resurrection. She talks about this, and one of my favorite sections of her book on this is there's a passage in Tertullian, and Tertullian is referencing these other Christians who are preaching that women and men should have equal rights, because including equal right to authority in the church, like actually be a minister, for instance. Because in the resurrection, we're all going to have the same supernatural bodies. We're going to discard these old flesh ones. And Tertullian was horrified by this. So he's insisting that, the body that died, the flesh body, has to be the one that rises, and it'll just be transformed. It'll just be fixed, be made better, but it will still be the flesh body, because the bodies in the future have to maintain the same anatomical differences between men and women, so that men can remain superior to women. So the gender hierarchy will be preserved forever in heaven, requires the physical body, right? So he has a motive for denying what I call the pneumatist theory, which is what I think is Paul's theory, and Origen's theory, which is this idea that, no, we all have this sort of, and even Jesus says this, there's no sex in heaven. No one marries anybody. Like, you're just like angels, you're asexual in heaven. But Tertullian can't have that, because that leads to consequences. Like, if everybody's the same in heaven, then there's no difference between men and women, and then we'd all have to be equal. That's horrifying, and that's Tertullian. So, and Tertullian is the mainstream, the ones who, he's part of the sect that decided what texts,
right,
what version of Christianity we have today. And so I think that's where this comes from. I think the idea that the flesh body is what Paul's talking about is an apologetic twist. Like, they're trying to make him say that. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the opposite of that. He's saying this dangerous thing that the Tertullians of the world can't abide. but I think the evidence is strong on this. And yeah, like I said, it's debated. So I'm not saying that this is the mainstream consensus, but I think the evidence is strong.
Would you say that the probabilities of it would be sort of like half and half, like a 1-to-1 sort of odds as to whether or not
No.
early Christian? No.
So I would say I would set the priors at 1-to-1, right? Because, and the reason I say that is on the background evidence, we have evidence of both types of Jews. So we have Josephus talks about Jews who talk about the flesh body being left behind and acquiring new, better bodies. But we also have evidence of Jewish thinkers of the same time who believe that the flesh rose. And in fact, there's a debate in the rabbinical texts over which it is. And so based on what we know, it's 50-50, because we don't know, like coming at Paul, we don't know which type of rabbi he is, and we don't have any poll data to see like how frequent either type of rabbi is. So as far as we know, it's 50-50. That's how we would start. And then we would go in and look at the evidence, and I'll just pick there's one evidence. There's tons. Like, so we go through item after item after item, and I do this in the chapter, but I'll pick one for a demonstration, which is that Paul says the body that dies is not the body that rises. And that's not a direct quote. It's a paraphrase. And so people can argue over, is that what he really said? But he basically says that. He says the body that you sow is not the body that rises. And what is the probability?
He directly says that Jesus is a life.
Right. What is the probability that? Yeah, exactly. Right. What is the probability that he would say that? And this is in 1 Corinthians 15 for people who haven't followed. And what is the probability that he would say that and mean the body that dies is the body that rises? Right. Like, it seems like, why would he say exactly the opposite of what he means? Like, it seems unlikely. And there's all this convoluted apologetics to try and make that the case. But so let's say the worst odds on this. Worst odds on flesh rising. I would say, how likely is it that Paul would say this? It would say the opposite of what he meant. Let's just put it that way. And I want to count it as much against myself as possible. So, like, what is the least, or I guess what is the most probable that would be? So for the worst case, I would say let's do 1 to 2, right? Like, so obviously it's not 1-to-1, it's not 50-50. It obviously would be weird, and weird is just another word for improbable, that Paul would say the opposite of what he meant. But I'm going to make it the least weird possible, because I'm going to be super generous to the other side and say 1 to 2. And I know on my side, I think it's 1 to 10, closer to 1 to 10. Like, and that's being unreasonably generous. I think it's maybe closer to 1 in 20 or something. It's very unlikely that he'd say the opposite of what he means. And so if we consider just that one piece of evidence on that range of odds that I assigned, let's see what we get.
Yeah, sorry, hold on. I was just correctly.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, you're labeling the evidence. And we're going to jump back after we look at the results. We're going to jump back and add one more piece of evidence. This is the probability that he means a flesh body rises. I guess we put the odds backwards in there, but
should it be 10-to-1? Sorry, should that be 10-to-1?
No, definitely not. Worst odds that the flesh rises. You're right. Yeah, that should be the other way around. So the 10-to-1 should be on the worst box, and 1 to 2 should be on the best box. But we just got that backwards. But yeah. Yeah. So everybody's watching. You can see what you can do here. Type this stuff in. Now let's get the results. Okay, that's still wrong. What went wrong? Let's go back. 10-to-1.
Well, so 10-to-1.
No, it should be 1 to 10. It's 1 to 10. 1 to 10. You're saying that he would mean the opposite of what he said. So right. It's So that's more like it. Yeah. Okay. So now let's go back and add a piece of evidence. And this is the creepiest, weirdest evidence. Let's put 2 Corinthians in here. Just type 2 Corinthians as the name of the evidence. So that refers to 2 Corinthians, which contains letters presumably written after the letters to 1 Corinthians. Now, what does he say in 2 Corinthians 5? 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says, our bodies, our future resurrection bodies, are already built and are waiting for us in heaven. There's like a clone farm in outer space where there are all these super bodies waiting for us to inhabit them. God's already made them, and they're waiting for us there. And now you can argue with me, is that what he really says? But you can go read it, 2 Corinthians 5, and decide for yourself. There's some issues with the underlying Greek and stuff like that. He seems to say that those bodies are there waiting for us. And so that would suggest these are different bodies than the bodies of flesh that we're going to get rid of. So what is the probability to say that and this, by the way, is just like the Heaven's Gate cult that thought the super bodies were in the spaceship that was going to fly, and they killed themselves so that their souls would transfer. I think that's right out of Paul. I think that's absolutely what Paul thought was going to happen. So, he thought the bodies would teleport down to us or something. It's not the exact metaphysics. You'd have to query Paul, and we don't have him to ask, so we don't know. But it sounds like he thinks that we're going to have the bodies swapped out while we're on Earth. So these new bodies are going to come down and envelop us, basically, and while our husks fall to the ground. So what are the odds that he would say the bodies are different than our flesh bodies and are already waiting for us in heaven and stuff, if he meant flesh? It's not likely. Let's do it again, 1 to 2, which is being super generous to the fleshists, and then do another 1 to 10 so we're stacking evidence. It's kind of the same quality evidence. That's why I'm assigning it the same scores. But what happens when you stack evidence on top of evidence? We have 2 pieces of evidence of the same quality. See, it keeps dropping. So the probability of that Paul believed in what I call sarcicist resurrection, which is resurrection of the flesh, when you look at the evidence, I think goes way down. And then, a Christian apologist or someone who wants to defend the other view could come in and try to present evidence for that view and argue that that evidence is improbable on the pneumatist theory, the one that I'm defending, and so on. And we would argue about, is it, and so on. And then, but you could do the math and work it out, but you would still be arguing over what are the probabilities of these things. So the probability of the evidence, whatever thing you're calling evidence, and you can put a box for it in here, and you can put the numbers in, and you could run the math and see what effect it has. You can go dink around with the numbers to see how would the numbers have to change to get a different result. And so there's a lot of things you can do with this calculator that can help you think through these problems, including figuring out where to put your numbers, because obviously I keep messing that up. But anyways, yeah, so that's an application, a very brief example of how to use the calculator to work through these things. And because you can keep changing the numbers, you can go back and forth and dink around and see what effect a certain assumption has on your conclusion and so on. And you don't have to do the arithmetic yourself. The calculator is doing it for you.
Yeah, see, if you make the bet, if 2 Corinthians...
See, now you're making a very strong evidence for the flesh resurrection. So that would be like as if Paul had said, that the flesh that dies is the body that rises, that would be it. But but if he had said that, in no way would the worst be 1 to 2. Because if Paul had said that, there's no way I would think that would be evidence against flesh resurrection. Because if Paul said the flesh rises, that would be, you know what I mean? It would be flipped the other way. It'd be 10 to 1. It would not be 1 to 2. Do you understand my thinking there? Because you would never have this range. It's very rare to have a super strong high. The evidence is super strong evidence for, and also it's weak evidence against. That's not common. To have that. Yeah, so that's an example. And that's considering the fact that we had the other evidence from 1 Corinthians above it, right? Still running. Anyway, so yeah, that shows you that even with 1 Corinthians, if Paul had said the flesh that dies rises, that would cancel out 1 Corinthians basically, or all but 50 to 99. That basically throws all probabilities at even or better. So
yeah. So, and it all depends on how you're gauging how accurate this evidence is, and I feel like that is
exactly
the main.
And it teaches you that, right? Exactly, it teaches you that. Am I being unreasonable when I do these? Well, why am I picking these numbers instead of others? It gets you to thinking about these things, and that's valuable, because if you're not thinking about them, if you're just relying on intuition, then you're not thinking about them, and then you're just coming up with biased ideas of what's probable and improbable, and you're not asking questions as to why you think they're probable or improbable. Why do you think they're so much more improbable than, so putting the numbers in forces you to think these things through and ask these questions. And that's valuable as a critical thinker.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Dalton, did you get your question answered?
Absolutely. And you know what? It was very fantastic to finally get to meet you, Dr. Carrier. And you got to get with John on that debate with that individual from TikTok. He'll fill you in. I'm sure he already has. And we're all very looking forward to hearing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is something you know about, John? I
yeah. I talked
if we've
to you
talked about
it.
I've forgotten. So
yeah, it's been a while because you've been really busy with moving and everything like that.
I've lost track of so many things. Like so,
it was so it's kind of like a modified Caesar's Messiah, with the exception that the individual thinks that the entire the Roman I guess the Roman state constructed Jesus as a way to destroy Jewish culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This individual is very big on TikTok, and I think it would help a lot of people to hear some good mythicism scholarship.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I have to tell you, I don't do debates anymore unless I'm paid extremely well. So, because I'm just tired of them, frankly, and they're a lot of work. So if we're gonna do a debate,
we'll just have to start a GoFundMe.
Yeah, you're gonna have to, yeah, exactly. You're gonna have someone can do a GoFundMe and collect the cash and distribute it, and then I'll do it. But yeah, no, I'm expensive now for that. Like I'm cheap for this. Like if you want to have me on a show, I'm cheap. But the debate, it's pricey now. But I'll do it. Yeah, if you raise the cash. But yeah, we can get behind the scenes and talk about it. What's needed and how to go about it and all of that. I'm open to discussing it.
Awesome. All right, Dalton. It was great hearing from you tonight, and I'll probably talk to you later on tonight too. So I'll see you later there, Dalton.
All right.
All right. So I did reopen the calls for the extra bit of Q&A. If people want. No more calls on the Bayesian analysis. We do have some super chats to get through, which I have some Bayesian stuff in it. But yeah, I wanted to open up the calls in case one or two people had some quick questions on mythicism for like a Q&A type thing. While we're waiting on anybody to call in that wants to talk to Carrier about that, we've got Jesus Tales, who's got this question. If I can show that Jesus of Nazareth is 90% constructed of 3 prior Septuagint Jesuses, how would I calculate the odds that Jesus is a myth?
This is a good question. And this came up with, I think it was Covington wrote an article about this long ago, like back when this all started. So back in 2014 when my book came out, maybe it was 2015, but it was a long time ago. We're asked this question where he thought like the Gospels are even more mythological than I thought they were. I actually think they're even more mythological than I thought they were myself now. The more I study them, the more amazed I am at the mythologization of Jesus in that. But the point I made back then, though, was that once you've calculated that you've hit a certain benchmark of mythologization, it's diminishing returns after that. So you can't be any more mythological than Jesus, basically. So like you could add like 100 more myths and about Jesus, and it doesn't count anymore. Like you've already hit the point, like, well, he's in the category of people that at best 1 out of 3 of them were historical. There's no more mythologization that you could do to him than that, right? So adding more evidence of Jesus being mythologized doesn't get you any more unlikely that he's historical, because you've already established that he's in the category of heavily mythologized people, and many of them have been massively mythologized too, right? So there's nowhere to go from there. So I would say, like, in response to this question, that if you can do this and show that he's, I don't care if it's 90%, any parts that Jesus is in the Septuagint, he's built out of. If you can show that in a structured article that would pass peer review, it would be a valuable contribution to the field, because I want to see more of this. I think this is what we should be asking, rather than trying to reconstruct a historical Jesus from the Gospels, which I think is a fool's errand. We should be diverting all that man and women power to answering a different question, which is, how were these stories constructed? So to give an example of that is my article on the 2 swords tradition. So you go to my blog and say, how do you win a war with two swords, or win a rebellion with 2 swords? That's not an exact title, but it's something like that. Where I go into this, where like if you ask the question, like we're not going to ask if this is a true story. It's obviously not. We're going to ask, why did the author write the story this way? Where did he get all the elements of the story? What was he trying to communicate to his audience with the story? Then you're going to start getting really interesting, valuable results they're true and more accurately and usefully explain the text. And you learn more things about early Christianity and its message. So even Christians should be doing this sort of thing. So this idea, like Jesus is. So I think, for instance, there's the Jesus who was the mythical or legendary or historical, maybe first high priest of the Second Temple was Jesus ben Jehozadak. And there's a lot of that in Zechariah, and I think a lot of our Jesus is built out of that. Not the gospel Jesus though. So I wouldn't say Jesus of Nazareth is. I don't think he's very much built out of that Jesus. I think he's the Jesus that Paul believes in is built, like the concept is built out of that. I think he's reading Zechariah as secret hidden God messages about his Jesus and not that Jesus, right? And we know that this was like Philo was thinking that Jesus was also some sort of, not that Jesus, but some sort of supernatural entity. So we know this is a going thing. Like a lot of people were reading that Jesus as being some supernatural super being and not the real Jesus ben Jehozadak. So anyway, that's an argument I've made on this stuff. But point being is, like, there's useful work to do here in what you're talking about. If we can find how stories about Jesus or ideas about Jesus are being constructed out of scripture that mentions people who just happen to be named Jesus because they believe they're about them or want them to be rewritten, that's useful work. It's so totally valuable, but it's not going to change the probability that Jesus existed, because we've already maxed out his mythologization in the Gospels, and then the rest of the evidence is the same either way. So the question is, like, could you take a story? Could you take a real person that you know almost nothing about, and then build a whole legend of him using characters from the Septuagint? And the answer is yes. The odds are the same as I've calculated. So the fact that he's built out of these people it's just as likely whether he existed or not. By which I mean just as likely as I already calculated, which is 1 in 3. So the fact that he's mythologized matters. It affects his probability, but it's mattered as far as it can already matter. So finding more of it isn't going to change those statistics at all. But that doesn't make it useless to do. I think it's a valuable way to study the Bible is to do exactly that.
Okay. Let's see. Next super chat is from Jesus Tales, who asks, if Jesus, son of Nun, Jeremiah, and Jesus of Nazareth were all rejected 40 years prior to a conquest of Jerusalem, how would I calculate parallelism?
So I have an answer to this question, which is so there's bogus parallelism, parallelomania as it was called, and there's sound parallelism. And sound parallelism is really just a literary skill called mimesis criticism. And it's practiced in literary studies everywhere. It's been introduced into Jesus studies by Dennis MacDonald. And Dennis MacDonald built a method, but he didn't mathematize it. But I take his method and show that it's Bayesian and how to construct it in a Bayesian way, in the way that you're asking. The end of chapter 5 of Proving History, I have a whole section on this question of how do you show that a story is mimetic, meaning that it's just some other story being rewritten with Jesus as the main character, which does cast the story into doubt as historical. But just because a false story is told about a person doesn't make them not historical. So those are two different questions you have to keep separate. So the answer to this specific question is you need to hit more criteria than that. So you've got one item. I haven't checked this, so I don't know if this is correct or anything. I'm taking it as you've written it. You've got one item. You need a few more. So if you can get, so what happens is, like, let's say this is 1 to 2 odds that this would exist by coincidence, right? Let's say it's 2 to 1 chance, or 1 to 2 chance that it's coincidence. And we'll skip the best and worst. We'll just set them both the same. But the question is, that's not enough. That's weak. But if you get another one that's 1 to 2, and you get another one that's 1 to 2, well, now you're starting to look at like decent evidence. And if you get something in there that's 1 and 10, so the point being is you want to look for all these different things. You can get more than one thing. The probability of a coincidence drops progressively, like geometrically. It gets halved over and over and over again. And so that's the effect of doing this. So what you need to do is find more pieces of parallelism that's beyond just that one thing. If it's just the one thing, it could be a coincidence, but you need a bunch of those, or a few that are like massively improbable. To give you an example is what the example of from the Septuagint mimesis that we have. This is mainstream stuff. Is the story with Jesus when he resurrects people, when Jesus goes around and resurrects a boy or a girl or whatever. Those stories emulate stories of Elijah, and some of them quote the King's literature like verbatim, right? And so, like, what is the probability that they would quote it verbatim if they weren't just copying and redacting and revising, updating, etc.? And so that's the kind of math you would do. You'd figure that, and if you have more and more of those things that conjoining in one place, you get the geometric effect. So how much have you put in there? How many items of evidence? I noticed I've one.
Oh, sorry. I was just kind of messing around. Yeah. So I've got 3 pieces of evidence.
Yeah. Okay. 3. Yeah. Let's see the effect. Let's just run it. I didn't know what your priors were. What did you set the priors to?
Oh, 1 to 1.
Very good. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, now I know the context. So jump back in to the results. So what is the probability that the story is real versus emulative, meaning it's just rewriting a story from the Septuagint? And
right.
You notice,
so
like,
I did a 1 to 2.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry. I did a 1 to 2 and then a 1 to 3 and a 1 to 3.
And they stack. So hit results again. And so, yeah, so you see that. Now jump back and delete one of those items of evidence and then go look at the results again. So yeah, so like the probability of it being historical is going up because we're losing the coincidence evidence, right? So you need more coincidences to establish that it's historicity, is the short answer. And then the long answer is there's a lot of different criteria that you can look at. The probabilities can be different than what we just thrown up, that we just threw numbers in here right now. That could be better. Like some things are just so improbable, like an exact quote of a Septuagint passage, like an exact quote of the Septuagint passage about Jesus, son of Nun, in a gospel narrative would be really strong. Like that would be not 1 to 2. That would be like 1 and 10, 1 to 10 that you would have that, right? By coincidence, versus it being indicative of an emulation of the story. So anyway, that's how you do that. Very basic coverage of it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Jesus Tales, for all of your good questions. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
JC asks, are there programs or games to teach kids Bayesian reasoning? Asking for my 12 to 14.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to this. Yeah. So Khan Academy has some decent stuff that might be approachable to a 14-year-old. It depends on how excited they are by math already. So there's 2 different problems here. One is getting them excited by math, and the other is like an approachable tutorial in a mathematical question. And so Khan Academy is usually what I recommend. For this age group, I'm not sure. There's somebody did something. You know what? Let me put it this way. You know who you should ask is Less Wrong. So there's a website called Less Wrong. And Yudkowsky is the fellow who runs that. I don't know if he's still running it, but the community that's there are all into this. So they would know the answer to your question. If you pose this question to someone at the Less Wrong community, they will totally give you this. Another one is, well, that's the one that comes to mind right now. That's the easiest one to access. So I would say start there as far as figuring that out. I myself, I don't follow kids' literature, so I don't know the answer to this. I would be shocked if someone hadn't done it by now, but Yeah, go find
Well,
out.
a quick search on the Android's Google Play Store doesn't show any good like Bayesian calculator. Like there's calculators galore, but there's not one that
Yeah,
focuses
what
on
they're talking
teaching.
though is teaching the principles. So you need something in the mathiness field.
Yeah.
There is a slight problem with the math community is in that they get very obsessive about being precise and accurate, and so they're very bad at communicating with the public. So like they start at a very advanced level and chafe at the very thought of like dumbing it down. Like they hate that, even though that's how you teach things. But so it's hard to find. Like you can find tons of stuff about Bayes' theorem, like Math World and all kinds of places, but they're written for the wrong level of reading. The author I recommend for, it's not for Bayes, but for the math you need to understand Bayes, is the 6th grade textbook written by it's Math Doesn't Suck. Math Doesn't Suck. Yeah, there it is. Danica McKellar. So she wrote a book called Math Doesn't Suck. That is probably one of the best math books I ever read. And I did read the whole thing. It's 6th grade math, but it's a bunch of stuff. I would say that 6th grade math is all the math that human beings actually need to use in their life. Like you go back to like other grades and they're teaching you stuff that's like marginally useful for most things. Geometry be the only other one that I would think that would have an application to almost everyone's life, other than like, solving quadrinomials and things like that. Like that, people don't need that mostly unless you're a specialist. But 6th grade is things like percentages and interest rates and discounts and how to add probabilities, how to add fractions. Like these are things that we really need. Like everybody can use them in so many aspects of their life. And her book is written for that perspective. Like here's a thing that you could actually apply this to in the real world. And I have often pointed out, like she wrote it for girls. It's written for girls of the 6th grade level. But I found it valuable even as a boy reading it, right? So so your boys could read it and enjoy it and learn things about girls while also learning math. And so it's not, I wouldn't like shy away from it just because it's written for girls. It's universal, it's content, and it's well written, and it does that. And everything you learn in that book is everything you need to know to do just basic Bayesian reasoning. And all you need with Bayes is then the formula. And that's the other step that this is the question I can't answer. I don't know if anybody has done this for that grade level.
Yeah, and so the specific question for people in the chat, because they're searching Amazon and everything and finding good books on it. JC was asking if there's programs or games that can help teach.
Yeah,
and so
right.
that's specifically what I was looking for as far as like.
And not what I know. Yeah, that's not my area, so I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But I think the Less Wrong community is the most plugged into the Bayesian universe, so they would know the answer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely love the math games that do exist. There's just, it's kind of few and far between, finding the math games. But I definitely think that it could be worthwhile, like, maybe investing some time into making like a little Bayesian game.
Not me. Yeah, that's not my field. Pedagogy, that's someone else. Yeah, coding and pedagogy. You need somebody else to do that.
Yeah, no, that would be me. I'm seriously considering it. Like, I think it would be a good thing to do. Awesome. Next is Margaret De Velden. I do want to remind Margaret, everybody.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah. I do want to remind
friend
everybody
from Canada.
Yeah. I do want to remind everybody that you can call 256-634-6984 if you have a question for Dr. Carrier. We will have time for maybe one question or two, depending on how that to y'all, since y'all did meet the goal there. So the lines are open if one or two you want to call in or whatnot, but we are going to work through the super chats. So Margaret says, greetings, John and Richard. I took Dr. Carrier's course years ago. I should take it again. Recommend. I think that's a good Yelp review right there.
Yeah, I assume this is critical thinking or historical methods, because I do Bayes in both of those. So on my website, top menus, you can find courses and see what I offer. And I offer all 10 courses every month. And it's just an online correspondence course using Google Groups. So
Yeah, and then here's one from my lovely wife, Casey. Hi, love you both.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So next is limited light. He's got another question saying also conditional probabilities, not Bayesian, would be used to predict in advance a priori.
Yeah. But the thing is that the data you're entering in, you're still doing Bayesian stuff. So, like, for example, we do this with in the Coast Guard. We use Bayesian algorithms for search patterns to like figure out where do we search for someone who's lost at sea, for example. So yeah, you totally use Bayesian stuff for predictive. One of the examples I give in Proving History is there's a whole textbook written by a CIA analyst about how the CIA uses Bayes' theorem to predict the probability that a country will suffer a coup or engage in an act of terrorism and things like that. And there's a whole backstory that you can go researching online, I think, about the two teams, the Bayesian team and the non-Bayesian team, regarding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There's a whole story behind that. But yeah, you totally use Bayes' theorem for prediction. It's just done differently than what we've been modeling here, but it's the same concepts: prior probabilities, likelihood ratios, and the whole deal.
Yeah, weighing the different types of evidence.
I should also note that Bayesian probability is conditional probability. It's literally, those are the same thing. But anyway, conditional probability is a broader subject, but Bayes' theorem is a version, an application of conditional probability. Every term in it is a conditional probability. Anyway, that.
Okay, next is Holy Space Jerks, who sent in a super chat saying the last election, Joe Biden had 81 million and Trump had 74 million. This election, Trump had 73 million and Kamala had 69 million. In case you were wondering, weird, almost 12 million short.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
so I don't know. I'm sure there are people who have access to the data and are smart mathematicians who've already talking about this. So I think you could go consult them. I wouldn't trust like mainstream media bullshit. Like I said, they'll just speculate. Editorials useless. No, go talk to people like Nate, or go look at articles by Nate Silver and people who do real math reasoning and actually know what they're doing. They'll be talking about this and they'll have information on it more than I will.
Yeah, it kind of seemed like Democrats just did not get out and vote, but I don't. That's just what it looks like on the surface level. I don't know why.
Yeah, and you got to break it down also by the contested states. You know, the swing states is different than the other states who stayed home and so on. There's different demographics. I've been noting articles about that too. So there was more new voters in some sides of this, and that has to be looked at and so on. Anyway, not my area, so I haven't, like I said, I haven't researched this, so I can't answer that.
Yeah. Mario sent a super chat saying, screaming to the tune of "Pod, abortion is healthcare." I mean, true. I agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we've got Kristen Hood. Hi there, Kristen. Says chances that Donald Trump leaves the U.S. with a very large deficit.
Yeah, above 99, right? Yeah,
definitely. I feel like his policies and everything that he's at least promised in the campaigin. I mean, they're going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I did a whole article on his platform, right? It's massively irrational. The thing is, what the Trump is like, he like, you don't even know, you never know what he's actually going to do. Like he'll make all these grandiose claims, but then he's not going to follow through on half of them, and the others he's going to fuck up, right? So like it's hard to really know what he's going to do just because he said it. Like the things he says on his platform are just phenomenally absurd, and they're not even achievable. Like they're just ridiculous. So the question is, how does that realize in an actual policy that actual people in Congress will support, even a friendly Congress will support? That I'm not so sure. Like, I really don't know. I think there's a lot of unknowns here.
Yeah, like I know the one thing that he said that he's going to be doing on day one is starting the massive deportation thing. But like, it's going to in order to deport like the 20 some odd million people he wants to deport, it's going to cost $2 trillion over the next 10
and there's logistics, there's complex legal issues. It's like, I mean, it's I want to say it's doable if someone competent were doing it, and I'm not advocating it, I'm just saying, like, if you had a like skilled operator, no matter how evil they were, if they were skilled, they could do it. I just don't see anybody. Trump himself, no way. He never hires competent people, so like I can't see him ever pulling it off. Like, no matter how hard he tries, I don't know. So I just don't know. I'm more worried about the consequences of the catastrophic failure to achieve his goals than even his most evil goals, which are already bad, right? So like anyway, I don't know. I think I'm in an unknown world here. I just have to wait and see and catalog the destruction and damage, so that when we get our house back, we can fix what the squatters did, basically.
Yeah, no, I totally agree about that. It's kind of a wait and see what happens.
Yeah.
Kind of
It's
situation
like, all
right
right,
now.
they tore out the copper pipe over here. Okay, we got to replace all that. Make a note. Yeah, took a huge dump over here. We have to clean that up.
Yeah. So we got Mario who asks, wouldn't you say that Bayesian reasoning is a form of dialectical reasoning?
Only trivially. So like in terms of dialectical, if all you mean by dialectical reasoning is you have one hypothesis, you have another hypothesis, and you try to find the synthesis, then yeah, I mean, almost all reasoning is that. And so Bayes' theorem, the way that's significant about that is that it prevents you from thinking about a theory in isolation from all other theories. So the one thing you learn from Bayes' theorem is that you cannot prove a theory true, which means any claim. You cannot prove any claim true without proving its alternatives false. So everything is contrafactual. So you always have to consider the alternative and take it seriously, because that's the only way you get the likelihood ratios that determine whether your theory is true or not. Is you have to say, like, does this alternative theory explain the evidence as well as my theory or not? And so you do have to look at both sides of every question. You have to. There's no way to do sound empirical reasoning without doing that. And so that's the one thing it shares with dialectical reasoning. But beyond that, it's Bayes' theorem is, a formally it's a formally established proof. It's mathematically sound. It's rigorous and detailed. Dialectical reasoning is kind of wishy-washy and non-precise in that way. But Bayes' theorem is more precise, which is not to say that every conclusion of Bayes' theorem is precise, because you can model imprecision with Bayes' theorem at the same time.
Yeah. I do want to say thank you to Mason for becoming a channel member. Thank you there, Mason. I hope you enjoy it. Been pretty shit lately on adhering to my promises as far as the members go, but I'm definitely trying to get back into a normal routine for that. Next is Gwen Grandcourt, who asked, did Kufu build the Great Pyramid? And I have no clue about this. I don't know if you do or not.
Yeah, so it's not my field. So I can't really answer that. I'd have to even check what Wikipedia says on this, but no, I can't argue one way or another on that. You need an Egyptologist to handle that question.
Yeah, and as far as Bayesian reasoning goes, I would say you would need to like establish your priors and then collect your evidence and then accurately like gauge how likely that evidence is, like on the worst case scenario, best case scenario, and then you can plug it into like the calculator.
And also you need to make sure you ramify your hypothesis correctly, because obviously Kufu did not personally build anything. He had other people build things. Right. So yeah, you make sure that you are correctly defining your hypothesis as well. So that's another part of it.
Okay. Let's see. Next we have Holy Space Jerks, who asked, what are the odds Mark is just copying Paul's letters based on the evidence?
Well, obviously he's not just copying them, because then they would just be a copy. Mark is clearly being creative and creating stories out of propositions that are in the letters of Paul. So he's reifying Paul's letters creatively. So he's not just copying them. As far as the evidence, I think that's really important. Like, you need evidence for this. So you can't just say it. I actually survey some of the evidence in my article on this, which is Mark using the letters of Paul. I can't remember the exact title, but if you do Mark Paul epistles, those 3 words, in the search engine on my blog, richardcarrier.info, you'll find the article. And I give some examples, but I also list a huge bibliography many studies, like multiple studies that go into even more detail on this. And the bottom line on that is like it's a question of coincidences. There's so many coincidences that the probability of them being coincidences is super small, millions to one. Whereas the probability that those coincidences would be there if Mark is reifying the letters of Paul is basically 100%. So you're looking at like 1 to millions, 1 to a million at least, that Mark is reifying the epistles of Paul. If you're going to argue against that position, you have a lot of work cut out for you. But if you want to see the evidence for it, that you have to like explain away in a way that's not improbable, you have to make it probable. You have to make the evidence probable to make the evidence go away. And that's the hard part if you want to oppose theories like that.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, so we got one last super chat, and then we did get somebody calling in to ask a quick question. But for this final super chat, we've got Grazy 174 who says thoughts of Freegan propositional realism. I have no idea what that is.
Yeah. I've read about it, but it's been a while since I've looked at it. I'm looking at a quick overview to remind myself. Oh, you know what? I wonder if I talked about that in one of my. I talk about the Phil paper surveys. There have been 2, and I did an article on each, and I might touch on this there, but I have to reacquaint myself as to what exactly that position is.
Okay. So
yeah, I'm just looking at a quick rephrase of that. I'd say it's close to the kind of position that I take. I don't know if I agree with it in its exact solution, but what it's attempting to do, I'm sympathetic with. That's all I can say right now. But so I would need to like spend some time reacquainting myself with Frege.
Right. I'm glad that's how you pronounce it. I had no idea.
The problem is with baggage fallacies. This is the reason why I'm being coy about it. Is baggage fallacies is that when someone says, "Hey, do you support, I don't know, Newcomb's paradox or whatever, like this particular," and it's like, well, I don't know what you mean by that, right? Like, so someone asked me that, like, they usually have this massive amount of baggage of what they think that means. And so I say, yeah, actually, I agree with that. And then they think, oh, so you agree with this other thing. It's like, no, that's not what I said. So that's why I have a problem with people ask this question, like Fregean realism is like, Fregean realism is this massively complex big thing. And like, you could narrow it down, like throw away all the baggage and narrow it down to a particular very simple thing. And I might agree with that. But that doesn't mean I agree with all the baggage that comes with it. And so that's why I hesitate to just say my position on that.
Okay. One final chat before we get to our last caller, who's a friend of the channel. It's Ashland. She's asking, how do we rule out any environmental factors to deem a personality disorder given the limited works we have on Paul? This is talking about the claim that Paul is schizotypal.
Yeah.
Like the likelihood of him being a schizotypal.
But what would be the environmental factors that we would need to rule out? That's what I'm not clear on. Because I'm actually sympathetic to this idea that Paul was schizotypal. I think that's highly likely given the evidence we have. But I don't know what the environmental factors are, unless that's a reference to the immortality key and the assumption that he's shrooming or something. But I don't want to like assume that I know what they're asking about.
Okay. If you want to give some clarification, we can definitely maybe clarify that before we head out. But I do want to get to Deviant Outcast, who called in to ask a quick question. Hey there, Deviant. How you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So what did you have for Dr. Carrier?
So I was a bit curious about sources for the early church prior to Paul, and what I'm kind of fishing for there is, it seems to me that Christians today are basically not as much following Jesus as they are following Paul.
Right.
So what do we really know about the Christian faith and the church, as it were, prior to, I believe his earliest letters are dated to like 70 or something.
So yeah, Paul would be
Maybe
right. His
earlier.
letters are written in the 50s, right? 50s AD. That's when Paul wrote. Yeah, but totally, he's a latecomer and a changer, right? Like, so the religion was different before he came along. We know very little. So it's true that we know very little because we have no documentation. All we have is what Paul says, and Paul's not terribly reliable because he has his own agenda, right? Like he wants to sell his position, so he's not going to tell us the things we want to know. The one, I'll just tell you, like, one thing we know for sure, based on what Paul does say and talk about a lot, is that Christianity was definitely Judaism. Like, you had to convert to Judaism, you had to be circumcised, you had to follow Torah, you had to follow all the kosher laws. You had to be Jewish, right? Like, Christianity was a sect of Judaism. You could not, like, Gentiles couldn't just wander in and be members. Paul created that. Paul created this idea that, oh, you can just join. You don't need to circumcise. You don't need to follow. You don't need to be kosher. You don't need to do any of that. He invented that. And I would say, like, gosh, maybe 99.99% of Christianity today is Paul's version. I'm not even sure if there are any sects of actual legit Jewish Christians who believe that you have to become Jewish, convert to Judaism to be Christian. And that's what the original apostles taught, right? Like, and they did do that. Like, they did, like, Gentiles converting to Judaism was a thing back then. Like, it was actually kind of popular. Whereas now it's like not, right? Like, it seems weird. Like, hardly anyone does that now. But that's because, 2,000 years of anti-Semitism is, kind of taught the Jews to lay off, basically. And so they don't want to, like, interfere, piss off the Gentiles too much by trying to evangelize them. And so, like, they've been cowed by, abuse for a long time. But back then, they were evangelists. They were actual Jewish evangelists who go out and say, hey, Gentiles convert, Judaism is better, and so on. And there are a lot of, like, Gentiles who didn't fully convert, but did hang out at synagogues and things, and were, like, they're called God-fearers. They were, like, they respected Yahweh and the religion and stuff, but they weren't committed enough to go all the way in. But then others were proselytes who did. And so we had a lot of, like, Gentiles converting to Judaism was a thing back then. So what Paul did is he found that market and said, hey, you don't even have to do any of this hard stuff. You could just be Jewish. And so they're like, shit. And so his religion exploded with a lot of members, a lot of money. And of course, that made that movement more populous, more financially powerful, and so on. And so the original Jewish Christianity shrank and shrank and shrank until it was gone. And there is a theory that Islam is a survival of it's an outgrowth and evolution of the original Torah observant Christianity that survived up until the 6th century. In the same way that Mormonism is kind of like a weird version of Christianity, caused by some particular guy. Islam might be some sort of weird version, like a new version of this original Torah observant Christianity. So such that Islam would be a sect of Christianity. And there's some evidence for this. I talk about this in my article on the historicity of Muhammad. Anyway, but that's a huge digression. But that's what we know, is we know that it was really a Jewish movement. And what Paul did is he made it possible to be Christian without being Jewish, which kind of defines Christianity today, right? Like, you think of almost all Christianity is either anti-Semitic or post-anti-Semitic, right? So that's radically weird. Like, the original apostles would be appalled at modern Christianity, but that's one thing we know. But there's a lot of other things we'd like to know that what was different about it versus Paul's version that we don't know. But that's the one thing we do know.
But so what are the actual archaeological or historical sources for
It's
that church?
Just Paul, right? So Paul, all we get is his side of the argument. And so what we can do is from that, we can infer who he's arguing against and what their argument is. And so in the process of that, like, he gives away a bunch of things and so on. So we have to kind of infer what he did differently from what he says based on the way he argues with people and stuff. So that's all we have, which is not great. We have also, we have Hebrews, which you have to get through an argument of like dating Hebrews before the Jewish War, so dating it to the early 60s. Not all scholars do that. That's not the traditional date, but I think the evidence is strong. But once you establish that it's early 60s, then Hebrews is an example of this argument. And that's where there's a full clash, where they're trying to argue. There's Christians, that the Jewish Christians are still trying to convert to Judaism. And Hebrews was specifically written to argue to them, like, no, don't, stay Gentile and Christian. And so it's like arguing against them being converted to Judaism, which is an interesting thing. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense today, but if you read the whole text by itself, it's bizarre. But that tells us like what the argument was, like who was arguing with who and what was going on. But that's as much as we know, and it's not as much as I would like to know, but it tells us things, and that's the kind of evidence that we have. We've got no archaeology from the early first century. We have no archaeology from the first century, like the whole first century for Christianity, like nothing. And even papyri start like 200 AD, like at the earliest.
Yeah, because that's kind of the thing that's got me thinking in these lines of thinking. I'm sorry, English isn't my first language.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm kind of sucking on this idea that Paul claims to have been persecuting Christians, and then had some kind of revelation and found his ways.
Right. Yeah.
Which to me sounds like the archetype of, this is the epitome of how a salvation story for all people who come to Christianity should look. Like, they have their wicked ways, then they have this encounter with Christ in some way, and they are saved, like he was saved. So it almost seems to me like it could be just Paul's. It's Paul's thing. It's his invention. What do we know about these persecutions that he's talking about?
Very little. Even less than Acts tell us. And we don't trust Acts. We shouldn't trust Acts. Because nothing it says is plausible. So we don't know. And he never gets specific. Like, he never says, for example, he never says he killed anyone. He never says he really even puts anyone on trial for anything. Like, he just is very vague about what he means by that. And I mean, to digress, this is not directly on point, but there's a lot in Paul's letters that we would like to know more about. And he's very cagey about them. So, for example, in Galatians, he says he had the revelation. Jesus came to him and he was persecuting, and then he was suddenly not. And he's like, yes, I'm on your side now. And then he says he went to Arabia. Okay. And then he returns to Damascus, which suggests actually Damascus is his hometown, not Tarsus, like Acts suggests. But the weird thing is he never ever again tells us anything about Arabia. He never writes any letters to Arabians. Like, what the hell happened in Arabia? And then we get in 2 Corinthians, he's talking about the Arabians are after him. Like, they're trying to hunt him down, like literally hunting him down. And his fellow Christians have to like sneak him away. And so you have to ask, like, what the hell did Paul do in Arabia? Right? Like, there's this whole story. There's this whole something, right? Something happened in Arabia. And it was his first mission. Like, as soon as he has a revelation, he goes to Arabia. Why Arabia? What's he doing in Arabia? How did he piss off the Arabians so much? And we don't know, right? Like, we literally don't know. We just get these hints. Like, he drops these hints, and we're like, we would love to know more about that. So there's more going on there, right? That's the thing, is like, there's a lot going on, and we just can't reconstruct it. And the frustrating thing with ancient history is oftentimes that's where we are, is we can't know. It's lost. We don't know. And so that's it. But yeah, so that's, that's the kind of the general answer I have to your question, is that it's most we can do with that. But yes, absolutely. Modern Christianity is Paul. It's Pauline Christianity. And of course, obviously, it's diverted even more than that. Like, there's like very little Christianity today is actually Pauline Christianity, but it started that way. It just evolved in its own direction. I have a girlfriend who often boasts, she's ex-Jehovah's Witness. She often boasts that the Jehovah's Witnesses have the one true religion, because they can actually defend their position from the Pauline letters, because they actually agree with almost everything Paul does, because they're not Trinitarian, and Paul's not Trinitarian. And so you look at most Christianity today, it's Trinitarian, which is Nicaea, which is Constantine. That has nothing to do with the original Christianity. Like, Trinitarian Christianity is so deviant. It's more deviant than Mormonism is, and the Christians hate Mormons, because they think they're so heretical. It's like, no, the Mormons are less heretical than most Christians. But anyway, I'm just ranting, but you get my perspective.
Yeah,
I do.
Thank you so much for calling. Go ahead.
Yeah.
A quick question, if only if it's helpful. I don't want to divert you or hold you. Someone asked something about ancient Egypt, and since I happen to have a master's in Egyptology, was
more than I have. So yeah.
Of importance, or was it something I can just quickly answer, or is it?
Yeah, for sure.
No, yeah.
What was the question? Because I cannot remember it.
So
it was something about.
They were challenging the question of whether Kufu built the Great Pyramid, Giza.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there is no question about it.
There's nothing to do with Christians. Yeah, you're right. There's no question about it, though. Yeah, you're right. I do think that's true. It's just I can't myself defend someone who's going to argue against it. We need an Egyptologist.
Oh no, but we have the workers' village where we have found ostraka, amongst other things. Where
for audience who don't know,
the name of the work.
Yeah, ostraka are broken shards of pottery that people would write on. Those are the post-it notes of the ancient world, was broken pieces of pottery. And so you have like writing on them, and that you can use. You can date the pottery, and you can date, therefore, the text on them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they call themselves like the great gang of Kufu.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
and yeah. So there are no, and also we have, even though it's said that there are no texts on, like, contrary to the Pyramid of Unas, which has these magnificent texts on the inside, we don't have that in the Great Pyramid. But the pyramid isn't just that nifty little giant building in stone. It's also an entire temple complex with a valley temple and a causeway and an area for where the ceremonies had took place prior to the coffin being laid into the pyramid. And from there we do have text that identifies this to be the Pyramid of Kufu.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because you gave me enough keywords that just now I did a quick search on Google and found articles about this, and so I threw one link into the comments. But yeah, super. This is the kind of stuff I love to hear. Yeah, this is the stuff that I do for my field, like Greco-Roman history, is this kind of thing. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for answering my question. It was very engaging, and I'm very happy I got to speak to you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank
fantastic.
you so much there, Deviant.
And you too, Dee.
Yep, no problem. You have a great night there, Deviant, or day. I'm not sure what time it is for you.
Yeah, it's very
Indicated.
yeah.
All
Yep.
right. Thank you so much there, Deviant.
Fantastic.
Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, that's gonna be it for the calls for tonight, and I so appreciate you being up for, like, taking calls from
Yeah.
audience and questions.
No, that's great. I haven't done this before. I don't think I've done a call show.
Yeah,
and I feel like we
let's-
accomplished things we wanted to accomplish, despite the fact that we ended up doing a lot of other things besides. So it's been good, actually.
And just to get back to something that Ashland asked, she asked about environmental factors and how we can rule those out as far as Paul's schizotypal. And she mentions extreme stress, sleep deprivation, priming, food sources, illness, lead. She also mentioned cultural milieu.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. So the stress, sleep deprivation, priming, we have evidence of all of that being common. Even Paul references, and like repetitive chanting, like that kind of like obsessive praying. So if you're doing a chanting over a long period of time, fasting, so you're basically having a nutritional deficit. There's all of these things are triggers for schizotypal episodes. And I talk about this, and I cite the science behind it in On the Historicity of Jesus. So in On the Historicity of Jesus, chapter 4, element 15 is about schizotypalism and all of that, and the science behind it and stuff. And so, I think those are more likely than what the immortality key guys say, like, oh, they're dropping acid and taking shrooms and stuff. Yeah, they had psychedelics back then, and psychedelics as a part of hallucinatory religious practices goes back to prehistory. It's definitely a thing, but there's no specific evidence of food or consumption having anything to do with early Christian hallucination. It all does appear to be based on what's called incubation, which is like sensory deprivation. So you take fasting, sleep deprivation, and isolation, where you're in the dark and there's very little sound and stuff. Combine all of those together, the human brain naturally hallucinates. It's built in. We're built that way. There's a book called, I think it's In Quest of the Shaman. It's a really good anthropological study of this, the fact that humans are inherently hallucinatory. This has had an evolutionary function, and we have evidence goes back to prehistory and so on. It's really good on this. So you don't need to resort to, Paul was taking shrooms or whatever. But one of the things they do find is that one of the most common hallucinogens in the ancient world, particularly prehistoric, was ergot, which is a particular mold, I guess, that grows on wheat or something. I might have that wrong biologically, but ergot actually is a hallucinogen, and it was one that people could be exposed to by accident. Like, you don't do it on purpose, and that would lead to hallucination. But you don't need a chemical to do it, like environmental factors like that, sleep deprivation, fasting, and that's so fun. That can do that. So you don't need the drugs to do it. And then if you're schizotypal, you're just literally just a nudge away from doing it naturally. And schizotypal means that you're on the spectrum towards schizophrenia. Now, you would have schizophrenia under current diagnostic terms if it becomes disabling. So like if you get to the point where it's counterproductive for your life, like it's hard for you to live and organize your life and so on, like it gets that bad, that becomes schizophrenia. But it's possible to be partially schizophrenic to the point that you're fully functional and you don't have anything that's detrimental, but you still do hallucinate a lot, and that's what's called schizotypal. And these particular people have been studied a lot, and they tend to generally gravitate into and get authority positions within religions that respect hallucination as revelation, which is not modern Western society. So to find schizotypals being successful outside the modern Western context, but it was very normal. And so when you go back to like when Paul lived, Schizotypality would be a ticket to authoritarianism, like the authority positions and success within religious movements. You would not be denigrated as crazy, babbling, insane. You would be by other people, the outsiders, but the insiders would love you and would think that you're actually getting communications from God, like they would take you seriously. And so you could leverage that and you could actually benefit from it. So schizotypals actually had an advantage in that society compared to schizophrenics in modern society, who are deeply problematic, aren't well cared for and not taken seriously. And so anyway, that's that. Yeah, environmental factors are definitely a thing, and I think it's realistic to talk about that in terms of Paul. And I would also say the other apostles, even though we don't have letters from them necessarily.
Yeah, and I remember doing some research into like this area, and like just the way that people that suffered from mental illnesses at that time were treated is incredibly different. Because like a lot of people would come back at you and be like, "Oh, so he was just crazy, right?"
Yeah.
Like they all thought he was crazy, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
no, that's not actually how they saw these people.
That's actually a prejudice today. So this idea that like saying someone's insane or crazy, yeah, people think babbling lunatic, eating grass or whatever. It's like almost no mental illness involves any of those behaviors. Almost all mental illnesses are entirely functional. It's just in the one thing. So like if you have like a extreme phobia, like if you're agoraphobic, you're totally fine. Like you're a rational person, you're a competent person, you can take care of your life, you can do all the things that any other person does. It's just the one thing is you're terrified of going outdoors. And it's irrational and you can't overcome it, and it harms your life because it makes it difficult for you to be a normal person. But that's it. That's what it does. So like you can go through all the mental illnesses, they hit a particular thing, and that's a problem on that one thing, but you're not a babbling lunatic eating grass, right? Like that's not what insane means, right? Like if you have a mental illness. So there's a lot of mental illnesses that you can be a completely functional person and be a leader and be effective and so on, while still having the mental illness that is also harmful and causes problems in your life and so on. So that's I think that's the modern perception is wrong, and it's you're trying to map it back onto antiquity. If you're going to talk about like delusions of grandeur or delusions of like personal delusions, like how many people think they're Jesus today, right? Because there are people in institutions who think they're Jesus. And they're completely rational, normal people that you can interact fine, except for that third rail. If you touch the question of them being Jesus like that, then they're massively irrational. They might get outraged, and they might even they might get agitated to the point of violence. It's possible, or if not, they'll flee. So there's definitely an irrationality. There's an insanity. But it doesn't mean they're a babbling lunatic. And that's I think there's a modern prejudice to the idea of mental illness, that it means that it means you're automatically incompetent and you're just irrational in everything to do with your life. That's not what a mental illness means. And once you understand that, well, now you can explain a lot of stuff in antiquity in terms of just ordinary mental illnesses, which are quite common and well documented. And we have a lot of scientific data about, so it's not even speculative. Anyway, so digression on that point.
Yeah, this has been a really great stream, and I really appreciate you coming on and having conversations with all the great people that called in.
Yeah.
If everybody will, I'm going to have links down below to Carrier's site as well as the Crestus app. That's in the description already. If you're interested in that, because we have a lot of scholarship behind it and everything. It is a pay-to-own app, but it's reasonably priced, and it uses a lot of great information that you can find in Dr. Carrier's books. And if you find the calculator really helpful in all this kind of stuff, definitely consider getting it. So yes, is there anything else that you wanted to leave everybody with tonight before we head out?
I think that's it. The only other thing is I am an independent scholar, so this is my living. So anybody wants to support me and my work, the main thing I do is I do the long form blogging, which is very rare, and it's ad-free, free to the world, no paywall, which means it really does impact people around the world. Like I get communications from people literally everywhere, from Egypt to China, even very rarely. But Australia, and so on, South America a lot, even Africa. So my articles do impact the world, and to do that, to make that freely available for everything, it's my Patreon patrons or PayPal patrons that fund that. And so basically pay me a certain amount dollars a month, which allows me to keep doing this. And I, don't have to get any other job. I can just do this. And I do 4 blogs a month on philosophy, history, politics, social issues, and for the world to read. So anyway, that's my main income now. Plus my books, get royalties on my books and my online teaching. So if you want to help support my work, or even hire me to do something, these are all possible things. You can check out my website at richardcarrier.info.
Yes, I do have that updated down in the description. It's in the information section. I've got a link to one of the blogs that we talked about tonight. It's the how do we know the Apostle Paul wrote his epistles in the 50s is the one that I have down there right now. But you can get down there and you can find on his blog there how to support Rick, as well as get in touch with him if you want to hire him for anything. I definitely suggest taking Rick's classes here because I took a couple way back when, and they were just very useful and just engaging in these kinds of topics online and everything.
And it gives you in a forum online, gives you a month, basically 30 days, to ask me all the questions you want about the subject of the course, and I answer daily. I take weekends off, but usually, but other than that, yeah. So it gives you an opportunity to ask me tons of questions in text format, and then I'll respond and so on. So it's more access than most people have the opportunity for. Plus I have like the guided readings, the guided goals, to learn basic skills. I think, like, if you want to be critical about history, what do you need to know? If you want to be a good critical thinker today in the 21st century, what do you need to know? Do you want to be a good arguer in counter apologetics? Do you want to pwn the Christians online? Techniques. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I teach. So I have courses on everything, including just your own philosophy of life. I do Worldview, which is Introduction to Philosophy. And so if you want to build your own philosophy of life, I use my book, which came up in this stream, Sense and Goodness Without God. I use that as the course text, not because I think you absolutely should just follow me like some sort of guru or something, but because it's a model of how to do it. And even if you do it differently, it shows you what is it you should be trying to do? What questions should you be trying to answer to build your worldview, to make a coherent understanding of reality and of yourself, to move forward? So I do philosophy, history, all of this stuff. And if you want to, a lot of people are interested in the Historicity of Jesus. So I've got a course on that, arguing for or against the Historicity of Jesus. I cover both sides of it. So yeah, I have courses on all different subjects, so you can check that out on my website as well. And yeah, it's that kind of thing. So you get that opportunity to engage over 30 days in an online forum.
Yeah, definitely check that out, everybody. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight, and I guess we will see you heathens later. I'm planning on doing a Red Dead Redemption stream tomorrow morning, so go to geplays.com and you will be able to follow my gaming streams there. And I guess we will see all you heathens next week when I post more conversations with people. So everybody have a great night, great weekend, and all that kind of good stuff, and we'll see you heathens later.